Chapter 1937. Oh Ming was speechless. Actually, he wasn't in a hurry, but Nanny Zhang's words made him even more nervous. Oh Ming took the cigarette out of his mouth and twirled it in his palm. It's been so long. Is you Lily hungry? Don't worry. She can't even wait to give birth. She won't feel hungry at all. Nanny Zhang's words made Oh Ming feel even more anxious. Qiao Ziqing saw Oh Ming's expression and said, Nanny Zhang, don't scare him. Lily is in good health. Who knows, she might give birth soon. Don't worry. Yeah, Oh Ming replied calmly. His pacing back and forth became more and more irritated. They waited until 9 p.m. when Oh Huijin came over and said, it looks like she won't be out for a while. Hurry up and eat something. Your health is more important. Qiao Ziqing glanced at Oh Ming and saw that he was extremely nervous. Oh Ming clenched his fists and paced back and forth. It was as if he hadn't heard Oh Huijin's words. Qiao Ziqing called out to him, and Oh Ming suddenly raised his head. Oh Ming, go eat first. Oh Ming glanced at them and said, you guys go ahead. I'm not hungry. I'll wait here for you Lily to come out. Wait for you Lily, not wait for the child. It seemed like there were only a few words different, but the meaning was worlds apart. Qiao Ziqing was both relieved and distressed. Oh Huijin said, we'll bring some back for you later. No need. I'll wait for her to come out and eat together. Oh Ming glanced at them. Mom, is it really painful for a woman to give birth? It's very painful. Qiao Ziqing glanced at him. You didn't feel any pain when your mother gave birth to you. Now that your wife is giving birth, you're like this. How realistic. It was a simple joke. Oh Ming couldn't laugh at all. He twitched his lips and waved his hand. Hurry up and go. I'll let you know when she comes out. Oh Huijin and his wife saw this and left with Nanny Zhang. Oh Ming paced back and forth outside many times. It was not until 11 o'clock in the evening that the door of the delivery room was opened. Oh Ming's eyes lit up. He quickly went up and asked, how is it? Congratulations, it's a little princess. Little princess. Little princess. Oh Ming was ecstatic and shouted, a girl. Princess. My God. He stepped forward and took a look at the baby in the swaddling clothes, but he quickly looked away and said, where's my wife? She's inside. Someone will push her out. I'll take a look at the child first. She'll be transferred to another ward later. The nurse held the child in her arms and looked at Oh Ming strangely. Aren't you going to hold your daughter? Okay. Oh Ming reached out his hand, but his eyes kept looking inside. Can I go in and see my wife now? Wait a minute, why don't you hold your daughter first? The nurse leaned over. Do you want a wife instead of a child? Oh Ming was a little embarrassed as he looked at the red-faced child in front of him. Soon, his eyes overflowed with a sincere smile. He hugged Zhang Xian carefully. Be careful, the pregnant lady is coming out, make way. There was the sound of wheels being pushed. Oh Ming immediately looked away and saw Yu Lily on the delivery bed. He quickly walked toward her. Chapter 1938. Oh Ming quickly stood still on the spot. Looking down, he saw the child in his arms who had his own blood. A smile appeared on his face as he looked at the slightly wrinkled little face. Then, he carefully followed. Yu Lily had already fallen asleep and was lying on the bed. She didn't look well. His phone rang, and Oh Ming jumped in shock. He quickly turned off the sound and placed the phone by his ear. Hello, Mom. Where are you? I heard that you've recovered. I brought some soup for Lily. Ming gave Xiao Ziqing the room number and quickly and carefully sat down with the child in his arms. He had never liked children since he was a child. Other than Li Ziqing's 2 children, he had never been close to any other children. Ming had never seen such a small child before, let alone held one in his arms like this. Ming couldn't help but laugh. He wanted to tease the child, but the little child had been sleeping with his eyes closed. He was very quiet. "You're acting like a fool," a soft voice said, and Ming immediately raised his head. Lily glanced at Ming and said, "It's a girl." "Yeah." Ming's face bloomed with joy. "I like girls." As if she understood Ming's words, the baby in the swaddling clothes moved and opened her eyes. A pair of clear eyes looked a little swollen, and her little mouth was slightly pouting. Her pink cheeks were even more pleasing to Ming's eyes. "Our daughter is so beautiful." Ming held the baby and said, "Come, call me Daddy." Lily laughed and said, "If I call you now, you'll be scared to death." Ha 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 ha. Ming laughed happily. He looked at his daughter and asked, "Why aren't you crying?" Lily was speechless. "Are you hungry? Mommy went to get you something to eat. Do you feel uncomfortable anywhere?" Ming reached out and touched Lily's forehead. "Why is it so cold? I'll get you some hot water. Give me the child." Lily held out her hands. Ming looked at the child and then at the water dispenser not far away. He reluctantly handed the little baby in his arms to his big baby. Ming placed the child by the pillow and stepped forward, saying, "Sit up first." "Come on." Lily only felt a pang of pain. He helped her sit up carefully, and he put a few pillows behind her. She held the child in her arms. His small, weak body and big, clear eyes clearly told Lily that she had given birth to a little life of her own. It was a wonderful feeling. Lily suddenly felt that she had matured a lot. The corners of his lips curled up unconsciously as he asked, "What's our daughter's name?" "Smile." Ming was pouring water. When he heard this, he turned around and laughed like a fool. "I've been thinking about it for a long time. I was just waiting for you to wake up to tell you. Her nickname will be Xiao Xiao. I'll think about her real name later." "Yes, Xiao Xiao." However, as soon as he shouted, Xiao 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 suddenly struggled and started crying. "Wow, what's wrong? Why are you crying?" Ming walked over with a glass of water. "Don't you like the name? Then Daddy will get another one." Chapter 1939. Huijin came in with 2 thermos flasks. They looked very large. Xiao Ziqing was in front, her eyes fixed on her precious granddaughter. A smile bloomed on her face as she said, "Oh, you're so pretty. You look like Daddy and Mommy." Her little face turned even redder from crying, and her little hands and feet moved. She didn't have much strength, but Xiao Ziqing was even happier when she heard that. She said, "Hurry up and drink some soup. The child is going to be hungry." Huijin placed the bowl on the table. Ming went forward to open the lid and help his wife drink the soup. Lily had no strength at all. She leaned against the side of the bed and didn't want to move. She said, "I have no appetite." "No, you have to drink some." Xiao Ziqing's tone was firm. She didn't allow any room for negotiation. Giving birth is like taking a trip to the gates of hell. If you don't drink some, it'll be troublesome if something happens to your body later. Be good and replenish your energy before you go back to sleep. You'll recover faster that way. Lily pouted, but she still took the bowl of fish soup from Ming's hands and took a sip. She didn't know if it was a psychological effect, but she didn't feel anything when she wasn't drinking. Now that she had a mouthful of soup, her stomach started to feel hungry. Xiao Ziqing glanced at it and said, "Eat some fish and other nutritious dishes." Mom, did you forget to add salt again?" Yu Lily held the bowl. The more she drank, the more tasteless it became. "It's so bland. You can't have salt." Xiao Ziqing carried the child. I'll get the nurse to ask for some milk." "Hurry up and feed the baby some milk later." Yu Lily's face fell. "Why don't I just feed the baby? Isn't breast milk the most nutritious? You have to be able to produce milk first." "I'm afraid there's no milk now." Xiao Ziqing carried the baby and walked out. Nanny Zhang had already left work. Huijin looked at the time and said, "It's getting late. Ming, stay here and take care of your wife. I'll get Auntie Qing to take care of her later. She'll stay in the hospital for a few days before going home to recuperate. Your mother's health isn't good. I'll take her home first." Ming was speechless. Yu Lily drank the soup and nodded. "Okay, then let Aunt Qing come here quickly." "Dad, I don't think Ming can handle it. I don't trust the special nurse." "All right." Huijin looked at Yu Lily and smiled kindly. "Thank you for your hard work." Yu Lily was a little embarrassed and said, "I'm a woman, let's go. Take care of your wife." Huijin patted Ming on the shoulder. "You don't have to go to the company for now. If I can't handle it, I'll pass it to you." "Dad, there are a lot of things you can't handle." "Impudent." Huijin glared at him, but he quickly chuckled. "Sleep early." "Good night, Dad." Yu Lily waved. "You're in good spirits." A nurse walked in. "How do you feel? Do you feel uncomfortable anywhere?" The nurse did a simple check and left. Xiao Ziqing came back with the baby in her arms. However, the baby had already fallen asleep and seemed to have eaten his fill. "I bought a breast pump. You can give the baby milk after you pump it out." "Yes, Mom," Ming said. "Also, the special nurse will be here in a while, but you must take good care of the baby. I'll get Auntie Qing to come over as well. She'll be here later." "Yes, Mom," Ming said. "By the way, Lily." Chapter 1940. This was the first time that Yu Lily and Ming had become parents, so they were unfamiliar with many things. For example, changing the baby's diaper, feeding the baby, and waking the sleeping baby up to drink milk, everything seemed novel and inevitable. After staying in the hospital for 5 days, Yu Lily's condition was much better. After leaving the hospital and moving to her home, Yu Lily felt a lot more relaxed. The baby had always been sleepy. Apart from eating all day, he only slept. He spent very little time awake. At one point, Ming thought that his child might be a fool. However, when he heard that it was normal for newborns to be sleepy, he was relieved. Yi Qianqian and Yu Lily hadn't seen each other for a long time. When she heard that they had a daughter, Yi Qianqian was very envious. She went to Ming's house with Shenjilia and brought a lot of gifts. Yu Lily was still in her confinement period, so Ming's mother was very strict and didn't allow Yu Lily to leave the room. Shenjilia couldn't see her at all, and Yi Qianqian was too embarrassed to enter their bedroom, so she simply played with the child in the living room. The newborn child was covered in a layer of pink, and her skin was so transparent that her blood vessels could be seen. Xiao Xiao's skin was very white, just like Yu Lily. She looked beautiful and obedient. Her eyelashes were long, and her eyes were closed as she slept. Yi Qianqian's heart was about to explode. "She's so cute, old Shin. Look." Yi Qianqian hugged Xiao Xiao. "She looks so much like Lily." Shinjilia glanced at the child's face, which obviously hadn't grown up yet, and asked, "How can you tell?" "They both have 2 eyes, 2 noses, and 1 mouth." This small face was very young and tender. The features looked small, but when put together, there wasn't much recognition. "Yes, they look alike." "Look." Yi Qianqian looked left and right and confirmed. "Look, they look like O Ming too. Look at the nose." "O Ming's nose is very high," Shinjilia said. "The nose hasn't grown out yet." "How can you tell?" Yi Qianqian glared at him and said, "Can't you have a little imagination? Look at the shape of the nose. It's so similar to him. The eyelashes are so long, so similar to Lily's. Look at the mouth. It's small and also like Lily's." Shinjilia replied, "Well, if you say so." O Ming stood to the side and watched them bicker. He snorted and came forward to carry his daughter back. He said, "Of course my daughter looks like me. It's said that daughters take after their fathers. I can't tell now, but when she grows up, she'll definitely be a beauty." "You don't really look like a beauty." Shinjilia leaned back on the sofa. "Lily, on the other hand, is quite pretty." "Well, your future children can't look like you. Yi Qianqian is quite cute. If they look like you, they'll be ruined." O Ming didn't even raise his eyebrows as he teased his daughter. "Don't you agree, Xiao Xiao?" Yi Qianqian laughed and said, "O Ming, why don't you move Lily somewhere else? I'll go talk to Lily." "Go in. It's fine. There's nothing to hide inside." O Ming glanced at her. "Xiao Xiao was born less than a week ago. So, they can't have sex." Chapter 1941. Yu Lily had long known that Yi Qianqian was coming. O Ming came in to inform her. She even changed her clothes and combed her hair to make herself look clean and tidy. Unexpectedly, Yi Qianqian still hadn't shown up. She had just sat down on the bed in disappointment when she heard a knock on the door. O Ming had entered the room and made some noise, but he would never knock on the door. Only Yi Qianqian would knock on the door at this time. Yu Lily's eyes lit up, and she said, "Come in." Sure enough, the door opened. A head popped in. When Yi Qianqian saw Yu Lily, she smiled brightly. "Qianqian, my God, you've become prettier." Yu Lily looked as if she had seen a ghost. She covered her mouth and said, "You've lost a lot of weight." Yi Qianqian subconsciously touched her face and looked at her body. She said, "No, it's just your imagination. How long has it been since you last saw me?" "It's true. You've lost weight." Yu Lily stepped forward and pinched her chin. "You used to have 2 chins, but now, get lost. You're the one with 2 chins." Yi Qianqian slapped her hand away in annoyance. Yu Lily laughed and reached out to pinch Yi Qianqian's chest. "Ouch, they've grown bigger." Yi Qianqian blushed and quickly closed the door. She covered her chest and said, "Are you done yet? Aren't you ashamed?" "TSK, TSK, TSK." Yu Lily stared at her. "Why is your skin so thin?" "Oh no, it's all over. Love really makes people vulgar. You've changed. You're the vulgar one. You've changed." Yu Lily said with a pained expression. "Shinjilia has trained you to be such a little woman. It's so scary. Why didn't I know he had such tricks up his sleeve?" Yi Qianqian's face darkened. "Why are you getting more and more shameless? You used to be more like a little woman than me, but now you're like a hooligan." "How am I a hooligan? How did you lose so much weight? Did you lose weight?" As Yu Lily spoke, she brought out a stool for her. Yi Qianqian sat down and shrugged. No. I just learned to keep fit from Shangilia some time ago. I stopped eating snacks and started exercising. F***ck, this isn't considered losing weight. Lily was envious and jealous. She pinched the flesh on her waist. Look at how fat I am. You're different. You've already given birth to a child. It's normal for you to be fat. If I want to have a child, I have to train my body a little better. Yi Qianqian was a little envious. Do you think fate really exists in this world? Of course. Lily blurted out. When she saw the complicated expression on Yi Qianqian's face, she immediately corrected herself and said, for this kind of thing, it exists if you believe it, and it doesn't exist if you don't. Why do you ask? Did Shangilia's grandmother read your fortune before? What did she say? Me? Lily thought about it and said, she said that my fate before I was 25 years old wasn't very good. After that, my luck changed. I think it was quite accurate. Didn't she say that I might be infertile? Even the doctor said that the possibility of me getting pregnant wasn't very high. But when she read my fortune, she said that I would give birth to a son and a daughter. After the wedding, I found out that I was pregnant. Lily shrugged her shoulders and looked at Yi Qianqian. Did the old lady read your fortune again? Yi Qianqian suddenly felt like crying. Yi Qianqian could be said to have seen Lily's fate from the perspective of a bystander. Chapter 1942. It was so accurate that it made her hair stand on end. Sometimes, Yi Qianqian felt that she was overthinking things. But it turned out that it was better to believe in such things. One look at Lily showed that it was true. When Lily saw Yi Qianqian's expression, she knew. She asked curiously, what did she say? I sob. Yi Qianqian felt uncomfortable and said, she said that I might not live past 28 years old. That I'm short-lived. Yi Qianqian hadn't even told Yi Zhenhua about it. She was afraid that the old man would worry. Apart from Shangilia, herself, and the blind uncle, only the Shan family knew about it. Now, Lily was one more person who knew about it. Indeed, when Lily heard that, her eyes widened and she said, no way. How is that possible? You don't look like someone who's short-lived. Yi Qianqian looked at her with grievance. What you think is useless? I think I'm doing very well. But, there seems to be a turning point in the future. She said that I might be infertile, or that I might die early, or something else. But, that kind of thing is probably not very accurate, right? Lily coughed and said, yes, it's true if you believe it. If you don't, it's not true. Old Mrs. Shen is a bit like a fraud. I don't think it's very reliable. Yeah. Yi Qianqian agreed. I think so too. Under such circumstances, we can only wait and see. Anyway. I don't really believe it. You shouldn't believe it. Lily glared at her. When are you getting married? Marriage. It's still early. March 5th, there's only a little more than a month left. It's not early. You have to be mentally prepared. Getting married is very tiring. I know. Yi Qianqian yawned. I'll take it one step at a time. I'm so tired. Why? Shangilia didn't let you sleep. Lily smiled ambiguously and gently touched her. Yi Qianqian blushed and said, are you going to die? How can you say anything now? It's nothing. We're all adults. Who doesn't know that? Lily smiled. But, have you gone to the hospital for a checkup? Didn't they say you might be infertile? Didn't you go? I went to see a doctor. Everything is normal, but I can't get pregnant. Yi Qianqian rested her chin on her hand and was a little puzzled. I've always calculated the danger period and the safe period, but I still haven't gotten pregnant. No protection. No, Yi Qianqian still felt a little embarrassed to answer such a question. Her cheeks were slightly red. Yu Lily could tell what he was thinking. She laughed and said, your skin is getting thinner and thinner. Shenjilia is really something. His methods are really impressive. He's managed to train our tough girl to this extent. Yi Qianqian was speechless. But according to what you said, both of you are planning to get pregnant, and there's nothing wrong with your checkup. Could it be that Shenjilia? Yi Qianqian widened her eyes and looked at Yu Lily. She had never considered this possibility. Shenjilia would have a problem. Pooh! How could there be any problems when he was so energetic and lively, as if he couldn't wait to kill her in bed? However, doubt was like a seed. It was easy to implant, and slowly, it began to take root and sprout. After verbally denying the possibility, Yi Qianqian was a little distracted when she got home. Shenjilia finished cooking and called out, it's time to eat. I'm so sleepy. I can't take it anymore. I'll go to sleep first. Chapter 1943. After placing the last dish on the table, Shenjilia untied his apron. Yi Qianqian sat on the sofa. When she looked up, she saw Shenjilia carefully arranging the bowls and chopsticks. Good man, good man. But, ever since she had returned from Yu Lily's place, Yi Qianqian had felt that something was wrong. She had been with Shenjilia for a long time. Except for the time in the beginning, she had not deliberately used contraception. But even after such a long time, Yi Qianqian had not shown any signs of pregnancy. There was nothing wrong with her body. It had been checked. Then, the more Yi Qianqian thought about it, the more likely it seemed. She stood up and went to the kitchen to wash her hands. As she washed, she thought about how to tell Shenjilia. Shenjilia had already filled the bowl with rice. When he saw that she was a little distracted, he asked, what's wrong? Yi Qianqian quickly came back to her senses and said, nothing. Shenjilia sat down and placed a bowl of rice in front of her. Are you in a bad mood? Did you get upset at Yu Lily's place today? Yu Lily had given birth to a daughter, but they had not done anything. Yi Qianqian didn't know, but Shenjilia himself was quite upset. Yi Qianqian glanced at Shenjilia and pouted. How could I be upset? I just feel that there is something. What is it? What is it? Yi Qianqian didn't know either. But if she said it, would it affect Shenjilia's mood? But if she didn't say it, Yi Qianqian felt that it would affect her mood. Thinking about it, she felt a little depressed. Yi Qianqian didn't answer. Shenjilia frowned and asked, what is it? She quietly looked up at Shenjilia and found that he didn't look too good at the moment. He reminded her, I feel that if I say it, it might affect your mood. It was rare for Yi Qianqian to be so hesitant. Shenjilia looked at her and didn't know whether to laugh or be annoyed. After a moment, he said, go ahead. Yi Qianqian picked up the bowl and took a bite. She chewed the rice in her mouth and whispered, I'm thinking about the problem of the child. Shenjilia relaxed and said, huh. Actually, he had already guessed it. Yi Qianqian had been unhappy and distracted ever since she returned from work in the afternoon. It was most likely because of this matter. It was expected. Shenjilia took a sip of soup and waited for Yi Qianqian to continue. Unexpectedly, Yi Qianqian widened her eyes and looked at him. She asked, didn't we go for a checkup earlier? There's nothing wrong with my body, right? Yeah, Shenjilia replied. It was as if he already knew what she wanted to say. Raising his eyes, he stared at her. Yi Qianqian felt as if she had been seen through. He coughed lightly and said, then, we haven't used any contraceptives for so long, and we still haven't gotten pregnant. I'm thinking, is there something wrong with your body? Shenjiliet paused in the act of eating and put the bowl down. The delicious soup in his mouth suddenly became unpleasant. Sure enough, it was a sentence that affected his mood. He put down the bowl and looked at Yi Qianqian. Did you hear it from Lily? Yi Qianqian smiled awkwardly and didn't reply. Chapter 1944. Yi Qianqian quietly lowered her head and drank the soup. She didn't dare to look at him. It seemed to be a very unkind thing to have such doubts about a man. Then what did you answer? Shenjilie stared at her with curiosity in his eyes. Yu Lily's imagination was even more wild than Yi Qianqian's. If Yi Qianqian hesitated or admitted it, then in her eyes, her man's dignity would be lost. Shenjilie felt a little bad. When Yi Qianqian heard that, she coughed softly and said, how could I answer? I said it was impossible, and then Lily didn't say anything else. Oh. Shenjilie nodded. Yi Qianqian felt even more uncomfortable and said, I think we can go for a checkup or something, do we need to? Shenjilie stared at Yi Qianqian. A pair of amber eyes, especially scorching. Yi Qianqian was scared by his gaze. She looked away and said, I think. Well, let's eat. Shenjilie had a strong feeling that if he let Yi Qianqian speak again, he would be even more upset. After eating, Yi Qianqian obediently went to wash the dishes. It was rare for a day when she didn't take the initiative to speak. She didn't even make a sound. Shenjilie sat on the sofa and sent a message to Luo Ran. If a man is infertile, how do you treat it? I heard that Luo Ran has been a lot more obedient recently. It seems to be true. Luo Ran quickly replied. Luo Ran. Shenjilie, Luo Ran, you are infertile. Shenjilie, Luo Ran, F*ck, you didn't do anything outside, did you? Why are you infertile? Shenjilie, no, it's just that my woman hasn't been pregnant. She suspects that it's my problem. Luo Ran, Shenjilie saw the string of symbols and felt even more annoyed. He replied, tell me what to do. Luo Ran. Well, men generally don't have this kind of situation unless it's congenital. Did your father and brother have this kind of situation? Shenjilie subconsciously thought of Shen Luofen. Although he wasn't married, the number of women he had impregnated was indeed more than his. He replied, I don't think so. Luo Ran, that's right. Your brother is very experienced. Even he is fine. How could something happen to you? Shenjilie, Luo Ran, go to the hospital for a checkup. Didn't you say that your woman is fine? If it's really you, then your woman will be wronged. Ha 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 ha. Shenjilie, finding Luo Ran was the wrong decision. Shenjilie threw his phone on the sofa in frustration. Then, he saw that Yi Qianqian had already tidied up the kitchen. Shenjilie walked forward and saw Yi Qianqian walking out with her head lowered, not daring to look at him. Taking her hand, Shenjilie pressed her down onto the sofa. Yi Qianqian was shocked. Just as she was about to speak, she was forcefully suppressed. Today, Shenjilie seemed to want to prove something. He was fast and ruthless. Most importantly, it was very, very, very long. Yi Qianqian couldn't take it anymore. Panting, she called out, Shenji, let's go to the hospital together tomorrow. Shenjilie panted and leaned into her ear. Let's go have a look. You, slow down. Yi Qianqian was sweating profusely and on the verge of tears. Chapter 1945. They went to the hospital early in the morning to register. Yi Qianqian sat by the side the entire time. Shenjilia's series of checkups took almost an hour. When he was well, he didn't look too good. They walked to the hospital's garage together. Shenjilia got into the car and said, "There was a female nurse who took advantage of me just now." Yi Qianqian couldn't hold it in and burst out laughing. Shenjilia pursed his lips and glanced at her. "It's true." Yi Qianqian quickly comforted him and said, all right. Don't be angry. You shameless nurse." It was a man. Yi Qianqian laughed even louder. Shenjilia glared at her, and Yi Qianqian stopped laughing. Shenjilia drove away unhappily. He was in a bad mood. Shenjilia pursed his lips and didn't say a word. He soon arrived home. It was rare for Shenjilia to be like this. Yi Qianqian followed behind him in silence. They went upstairs and returned home. As soon as Shenjilia entered the house, he went straight to the bathroom. After taking a shower, he saw Yi Qianqian sitting on the sofa and pounced on her. Yi Qianqian felt as if she was facing a formidable enemy. She immediately shouted, "Stop!" Shenjilia didn't listen. He took off her clothes and said, "Men who are infertile will have sexual disorders." Oh, sexual disorders. That didn't exist. Yi Qianqian felt as if she had died and come back to life again. The day passed in a daze. When she woke up, Shenjilia wasn't by her side. When she walked out, he was sitting on the sofa, looking at the computer. It was dim, and the lights weren't on. Shenjilia was wearing a thin shirt and sitting cross-legged. Yi Qianqian walked over and hugged him from behind. Shenjilia's body was very cold, from his body to his face. He gently placed his big hand on the back of her hand and kissed it gently. Yi Qianqian glanced at his computer screen. There was a case on it. She could tell that it was the patient's information. "Are you busy?" Yi Qianqian's voice was very soft, but it broke the silence in the empty space. "Yeah," Shenjilia replied in a low voice. "Are you hungry? Let's go out to eat." "I'm not hungry." Yi Qianqian felt a little guilty. She asked, "Do you want some noodles?" "I'll cook some noodles for you." "You're going to make me eat noodles?" Shenjilia glanced up at her. Yi Qianqian was taken aback. She blushed and said, "Cook noodles." Shenjilia chuckled and quickly replied, "Sure." Yi Qianqian released him and took out a coat from inside. She tossed it at him and said, "You won't freeze to death. Put it on." The corners of Shenjilia's lips curled into a smile. He quickly put it on and seemed to have thought of something. He said, "By the way, I'm going back to the capital tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" "Yes, I'm going back to work." Shenjilia straightened his clothes. "Come to the capital in 2 weeks. We'll go to the Civil Affairs Bureau." "Sure," Yi Qianqian replied without hesitation. Everything had been arranged. Just complete everything according to the schedule. As Yi Qianqian cooked the noodles, she suddenly felt like a married woman. The way she was now, could she be considered a good wife and loving mother? The two of them ate the noodles and slept in their clothes. During the day, he was restless. At night, Yi Qianqian was on high alert and refused to let him touch her again. Shenjilia laughed to himself, but he didn't make any more moves. The next day, when Yi Qianqian woke up, Shenjilia was already gone. Chapter 1946. When Yi Qianqian returned to the office, she was extremely busy. Within a few days, she received Shenjilia's checkup report. The report was simple. There were no problems. Everything was normal. The sperm survival rate was higher than that of a normal person. However, she couldn't conceive a child. When Yi Qianqian sent the picture to Shenjilia, he replied with a smiley emoji with a few words, "This is fate." Sigh. This is fate. 2 weeks was neither long nor short. Yi Qianqian had already booked a ticket. When she got off the plane, Shenjilia was already waiting for her outside the airport. When she saw Shenjilia, Yi Qianqian almost pounced on him. She wrapped her arms around his waist and said with a smile, "I'm here." Shenjilia's eyes were filled with affection. He held her in his arms and took her luggage. The two of them quickly went down to the garage. "Have you eaten?" "I just had an airplane meal." "It was terrible." Shenjilia smiled. "If you're not hungry, let's go to the Civil Affairs Bureau first and then find Mom and Dad for dinner." Yi Qianqian secretly clicked her tongue and said, "That's so sudden. Have you arranged everything?" "Yeah. Grandma went to play with Grandma Dongfang recently. She won't be back for a while. Don't be afraid." When Yi Qianqian heard that, she relaxed a little and said, "All right then. Let's go." Shenjilia had already made a reservation before he came. When he arrived, he didn't have to wait in line and went straight to get the certificate. When Yi Qianqian received the 2 red booklets, she still felt a little surreal. The marriage certificate was simple. On the red cover, the words "Marriage Certificate" were embossed in gold. There was only a thick piece of paper inside with their photos and names. But it was so simple that it felt like a dream. "We're getting married." Yi Qianqian looked at Shenjilia. "That's so sudden." Shenjilia raised his eyebrows slightly and pulled her into his arms. "It's too late to regret it now. You're already mine." Yi Qianqian blushed slightly and whispered, "I've always been. We have a certificate in the future. Your name is written on my household register. You can't run away." Shenjilia lowered his head and gently kissed her forehead. "Let's go. Mom and Dad are waiting for us. When I see your parents later, what should I call them?" "Call me Daddy and Mommy." "Call me whatever I call you." Shenjilia retrieved the car and started it. When they arrived, Yi Qianqian realized that there were quite a few people there. All kinds of relatives that she had seen and not seen before were gathered together. There were at least a dozen of them. Yi Qianqian felt a little uncomfortable and asked in a low voice, "Why are there so many people?" "Grandma said that we should have a small celebration first and invite the others in March. On March 15th, we will go to Yuntown to celebrate again. Only then will the wedding be over." "So many. Which one is the official one?" "The 5th of March. That's the best day." Shenjilia planted a gentle kiss on her cheek. The people around them who saw it were in an uproar. Yi Qianqian's face turned red, and she didn't speak for a long time. Shen Longyue and Mrs. Shen had been waiting for them for a long time. When they saw Yi Qianqian, they waved at her. "Qianqian, come and sit here." Yi Qianqian wanted to greet him, but she couldn't change the way she addressed him. After holding it in for a long time, he still couldn't utter a single word. Shenjilia could tell that and whispered, "It's okay. Take your time. Let's go over first." "Okay." Chapter 1947. A simple family dinner was considered a simple and formal meeting gift between relatives. However, it was just a meeting. After the meal, Yi Qianqian followed Shenjilia back to the Shen residence. As soon as they entered the Shen residence, they heard the crying of a baby. Such a sound was particularly jarring in a family with no children at all. Yi Qianqian looked at Shenjilia and asked, "Where did the child come from?" The corners of Shenjilia's mouth turned up slightly, but he didn't answer immediately. He walked in with Yi Qianqian and immediately saw a nanny holding the child and coaxing him. Yi Qianqian hadn't seen many children, but this child didn't look like he was just born. He was at least a month or 2 old. Yi Qianqian leaned forward and looked at him curiously. She asked, "Whose child is this?" "Nanny," he smiled and said, "Young master's child." Yi Qianqian was shocked and immediately understood. She looked at Shenjilia, who nodded at her and said, "You guessed right." Yi Qianqian gasped and said, how could she agree to send the child over? Shen Luoan was a jerk. As a husband and a man, Yi Qianqian didn't think he was a success. Could such a person really take care of a child? "Where is she?" Yi Qianqian asked. Shenjilia just glanced at her and said, "I don't know. My brother said she died." "How is that possible?" Yi Qianqian couldn't believe it, but at the same time, she felt a little sad. Shen Manting's fate was really not good. She met Shen Luoan and old Mrs. Shen. Sigh. "I don't believe it either." Shenjilia sighed softly. "Do you want to hold the child?" Yi Qianqian wanted to hold the child, but she didn't dare to. It was Shen Manting's child. Shen Luoan's child. But after staring for a while, she couldn't help but reach out and take the child. The child couldn't stop crying. His little face was red from crying, and his voice was loud. "Is it a boy or a girl?" Yi Qianqian stared at the child and squeezed his little hand. Miraculously, the moment Yi Qianqian squeezed, the child's crying became a little softer. As if curious, he opened a pair of wet, dark eyes and stared at Yi Qianqian. "He's so pretty." Yi Qianqian looked at the baby in her arms, and a smile spread across her lips. "The boy's name is Shen Yueshao." Shenjilia looked at the child. "What do you think about the name Grandma gave him?" "That sounds good," Yi Qianqian exclaimed. "You mean beyond?" "Yes, a Shao who is brave and skilled in battle." "It's really not bad." "Did Grandma come up with this name?" "I don't know." Shenjilia stared at him. "The child was already here when I returned to the capital, but Sister Manting didn't come back." "You didn't see him?" "No." Shenjilia was a little self-deprecating. "My brother said she's dead." "Where can I find her?" Yi Qianqian was silent. She found it hard to believe. Shen Manting wouldn't die so easily, right? January 25th, sunny. During the new year, he came to visit me with more than a dozen bags of tonics. Without my permission, he entered the rented apartment without permission. I didn't dare to go home, and I got soaked in the rain. My stomach hurts, it's all because of this bastard. The 27th of January, rain. Her stomach hurt for a long time, but the baby still came out. It's a boy. It said that children born during the new year have the best lives. They won't be at a disadvantage in terms of age. They'll live a full life. Fortunately, the baby is very healthy and didn't get sick because of my malnutrition. Chapter 1948. What is the purpose of a person's life? If she asked this question, perhaps no one would know the answer. Shen Manting asked herself this question over and over again. What is the purpose of living? But after thinking about it for a long time, she still couldn't figure it out. But she didn't dare to die. She was like a gambler who had nothing left. She had risked everything, but in the end, she still lost everything. Originally, she wanted to give birth to the child and use it as a bargaining chip to threaten Shen Luoan. Even Shen Manting herself didn't know what exactly she wanted to force him to do. However, the longer she got pregnant, the less she thought about it. As his belly grew bigger and bigger, his desire for this child grew stronger and stronger. When she saw Shen Luoan again, she suddenly realized that she had done something wrong. She shouldn't have kept the child in the first place. She thought that she would be cold to the end. The child was a bargaining chip and a means. But she didn't expect that in the end, it would become a shackle that tortured her. January 28th, there will be a thunderstorm. Baby, I was wrong. No one will take care of you, and no one will take care of me. I'm running out of money. The nurse said that they can't take care of you. I'm useless. I can't give you milk. I'm sorry that you're hungry. The weather is getting worse. I can't take it anymore. Enchanting lay on the hospital bed. Her face was pale. She stared at the soft tube that was constantly pumping water into her body. Suddenly, she smiled gently. The baby lay in the crook of her arm, sleeping peacefully and peacefully. But the pain in her lower body made her feel hopeless. Enchanting, it's time to eat. The nurse called out. Perhaps it was because her voice was too loud, or the thunder that sounded at the same time was too shocking. The baby in her arms suddenly twitched, then opened his mouth and cried. Enchanting felt a little weak. She gently patted the baby's back, slowly and gently. Enchanting endured the pain and sat up. She lifted the hem of her clothes and wanted to feed the baby. However, after the baby sucked on his soft lips a few times and realized that there was nothing there, he began to cry loudly again. The nurse rudely and impatiently put down the table. She placed the food on the table and went to call the next person. Zhang Chunhua. Hey, let me do it. In the same ward, a simple and honest man took the lunchbox from the nurse and said with a smile, "Thank you, nurse. You're beautiful and kind." "Thank you." The nurse's face looked much better. She silently handed over an extra egg. The man laughed even more happily and said, "Thank you, thank you." Then, holding the bowl of rice, he turned to his wife and said, "This nurse is really nice. Come, have an egg to feed our baby. A newborn baby needs nutrition the most." His gentle and honest voice was not pleasant to the ears. But at this time, it was enough to warm the heart of a woman who had just given birth to his child. Tears welled up in her eyes. She gritted her teeth and sat up, shielding the crying baby in her arms. After breaking the eggshell, he peeled it off bit by bit and slowly ate it. When a child cried, the other children in the ward were inevitably affected. Soon, the other child began to cry. A woman with a bad temper had given birth to her third child. Chapter 1949. His voice was full of resentment and harshness. She hugged her child and coaxed him. She murmured, "Good boy, don't cry. Wait for Daddy to come back and hold you." Enchanting was silent. She chewed the egg in her mouth and swallowed it slowly. But the boiled egg was too dry, and Enchanting almost choked. She forced herself to swallow it and reached for her glass of water. However, the water in the cup that she had asked the nurse to get was gone. She drank the last mouthful and finally felt a little better. However, the child in her arms was sobbing uncontrollably. When Enchanting saw her blushing face, she couldn't help but feel aggrieved. Tears welled up in her eyes. She raised her hand and slapped her little face. She shouted, "Be quiet." But the child in her arms did not calm down. Instead, he cried even harder. The other mothers in the ward looked over. Enchanting acted as if she didn't see it. She swallowed the last mouthful of the egg and then grabbed the chopsticks to eat the food in the lunchbox. It was terrible. It was really terrible. But Enchanting still took big mouthfuls of food. Her vision was blurred, and her throat was sore from choking. Enchanting's stomach was still not full after the last mouthful of food. She pulled the curtain up and directly lifted her clothes to feed the child. The child sucked a few mouthfuls and was quiet for a few seconds. But soon, he struggled and cried again. He took a deep breath and tears fell. Enchanting didn't say anything. She hugged the baby and gently coaxed him. After a while, she let him suck again. After she finally calmed the baby, Enchanting finally lay down exhausted. She closed her eyes and fell asleep with the child in her arms. Suddenly, Enchanting loosened her arms and trembled. Someone was stealing the child. As soon as this thought flashed through her mind, Enchanting's entire body tensed up. She opened her eyes abruptly and saw a man. A young man. His hand was reaching toward her arms as if he wanted to hold the child. "You're awake." Enchanting's voice was very low, and she couldn't hear his emotions. Enchanting relaxed, but she immediately reached out and snatched the child back. Seeing that the baby was safe and sound, she stared at Enchanting vigilantly. Enchanting glanced at his watch and said, "Are you hungry? I'll buy you something to eat." "Wait for me." "I don't need you," Enchanting finally said. Her voice was hoarse from a prolonged drought. "I have food to eat. Don't throw a tantrum with me," Enchanting said in a displeased tone. He turned around and walked out the door. When he came back, he was holding a thermos flask. He opened it, tested the temperature, and said, "Drink some water." Enchanting hadn't drunk water for a long time, and her mouth was extremely dry. Seeing the thermos flask, he subconsciously swallowed a mouthful of saliva. However, he couldn't do it no matter what. She turned her head away to avoid looking at him. She carefully placed the infant beside her. Enchanting's face tightened. "Are you trying to starve your child to death by not drinking water? When he wakes up, he won't even have a sip of milk. Isn't that pitiful?" Enchanting gulped again, averted her eyes, and extended her hand. The water temperature was just right. Enchanting drank so quickly that her throat hurt. But at least he had quenched his thirst. She handed the cup back to him, wiped her chin, and asked, "What do you want?" Chapter 1950. Everyone knew. Enchanting's heart was as clear as a mirror. But go back with him. She looked up at Enchanting. In her heart, there was only resistance. If she went back with him, what awaited her would be endless torture. She had finally managed to escape, and he wanted her to go back. Dream on. It's fine if you don't go back. Get discharged first. I'll hire a nanny to take care of you. Enchanting stood tall and looked down at her. "I want to see the child, but Julia brought his girlfriend home recently, and I can't get away." "Oh," Enchanting replied. "Then go take a photo." Enchanting looked at her with a sullen face and said, "It's best if you go back with me." "Do you think that's possible?" "I'm old. To be fair, I treat you well." "Yes, but someone treats me badly." Enchanting lowered her head. "Go. You don't have to worry about me and the child. This is my child. Don't you have any shame?" Enchanting glared at him angrily. "When did my child become your child?" Enchanting didn't lower her voice. Many people in the ward looked over. Enchanting didn't seem to care and said, "If it's not my child, who did you have it with?" "The heir. I had it with someone else." Enchanting clearly felt all kinds of gossipy gazes coming from around her. She was a little angry, but she quickly whispered, "I don't want to talk to you about this here. Go away." "Well, then I'll get you discharged." Enchanting turned and walked away as he spoke. Enchanting was annoyed and said, "Enchanting, why are you so nosy?" However, Enchanting had already walked away as if he hadn't heard her. The other mothers in the ward looked at each other. Enchanting clearly heard the mother in the next bed say to the mother in the other bed, "I thought she was pregnant before marriage. It turns out she has a man. That man is quite handsome. Why is he like this? He's also nice." He didn't wake her up. He stood there for a long time, but as soon as he woke up, he quarreled. Sigh, some people just don't know how lucky they are. If I had such a handsome man, I would die of laughter. Enchanting felt like she was sitting on pins and needles. She looked at the child in her arms and wanted to get up. She hadn't urinated for a long time, and the moment she got up, she felt the urge to go to the toilet. He carried the child and got up, but as soon as he got off the bed, he felt his legs go soft. She almost fell. She held on to the edge of the bed to steady herself and walked to the bathroom. There was a tray in the toilet for mothers and children. Enchanting placed the baby on it and went to the toilet herself before she came out. As soon as she came out, she saw Enchanting's anxious expression. Enchanting's expression softened when he saw her. He heaved a sigh of relief and said, "What's going on? Why did you bring your child to the toilet? What if I accidentally fall?" Enchanting felt a pang in her heart. As expected, a man who doesn't love you has a strange focus. He was actually worried that she would drop the baby. She pursed her lips and walked towards her bed with the child in her arms. "Let me give you a hug." Enchanting looked at her pink face, and his heart was filled with desire. This was his first child. Chapter 1951. I've already gone through the discharge procedures. This bed is not yours anymore. Enchanting looked at her. Which things are yours? I'll pack them up for you. Enchanting's expression suddenly changed, and she roared, "What right do you have to do that? I'm the child's father. I have the right to take care of your body." Enchanting pulled her up. "How can you take care of your body here? Come back with me. Look at this ward. Which woman is thinner than you? How can you take care of the child if you're so thin?" Enchanting didn't know if it was an illusion, but she heard some heartache in Enchanting's voice. She looked at Enchanting and saw that his face was unfriendly. He had lost a lot of weight compared to before. During this period of time, he had also experienced a lot of things. Enchanting pursed her lips and didn't speak under the gazes of the gossipy people around her. Enchanting looked around and found nothing special. He said, "Buy whatever you need. Change your clothes. I brought you a set of clothes." As he spoke, he picked up 2 paper bags from the ground. Enchanting saw that there was a bunch of flowers and a fruit basket on the ground. The flowers were beautiful and bright, and the fruit basket was beautiful and fresh. Enchanting took the paper bag and saw that there was a down jacket inside. The color was beige, which used to be her favorite color. In the other bag was a slightly thin dress. She lifted it up and found clean underwear underneath. "I'll wait for you here." Enchanting sat down and reached out to pick up the child. However, Enchanting didn't hand the child to him. She carried the 2 bags into the mother and baby's room and put the child down before she changed her clothes with peace of mind. She didn't dare to give the child to him. If Enchanting took the child away, she would really have nothing. After changing her clothes, Enchanting glanced at her appearance in the mirror. Her face was sallow, and her overly thin cheeks were slightly sunken. Her hair was messy, and she didn't take care of it at all. She untied her loose ponytail and carefully tied up her hair. After wiping her face, she walked out with the child in her arms. The child had been sleeping as if he didn't feel hungry and slept carefreely. When she walked out, the other young mothers in the ward felt that Enchanting's body had a new look. So beautiful. Clothes make the man. Hey, why do you have to be so pretentious when you have such a good man? I thought you were a girl from some family who secretly came here to give birth. That's right, you're going home with your man. These clothes aren't cheap, right? They look really good. Envious voices and secretly jealous gazes. Shenmanting accepted them one by one but didn't respond. Shenluo and squatted down and took out a shoe box. He said, "Wear shoes. 37, right? I don't think I'm mistaken." "You're wrong." Shenmanting lowered her head. "I'm wearing a 38. But he still stretched out his leg and stepped on it. He stuffed it in, but it didn't fit. She raised her eyes to look at Shenluo, and an uncomfortable thought came to her mind. Yi Yu wore a 36, and she wore a 38. Shenluo probably couldn't remember who was who, so he bought a number in the middle. Thinking of this, his eyes were filled with mockery. However, she still hugged the baby tightly and refused to let go. "I want to eat." "Okay, let's go home first." Chapter 1952. Shenluo looked at her vigilant face and felt a little upset. After a moment of silence, he said, "I rented a small house nearby. We can stay there for the time being." Shenmanting was slightly relieved when she heard that. "Well, let's go." Shenmanting held the baby in her arms and walked forward. Shenluo looked at her back and moved his lips, but he didn't say anything. Although it was nearby, it was impossible to walk there. They took a taxi and sat in the back. The baby was very quiet. But when they reached the place, the baby suddenly struggled and cried. He opened his mouth and cried. Shenmanting's heart ached when she heard it. She gently patted his little body and said, "Don't cry, don't cry. Mommy will take you to sleep." Her every movement was filled with the radiance of motherly love. Shenluo stared at this woman deeply, and there was a strange feeling in his heart. This was his sister and the mother of his child. This strange and magical relationship made Shenluo feel very complicated. They opened the door and walked in together. Shenmanting found that this place had been lived before. But the furniture was relatively new, and there were fresh flowers on the table. Obviously, Shenluo lived here. Shenluo had always had a little habit. There needed to be fresh flowers in the room and in the office. It had nothing to do with aesthetics. Sometimes it could be roses and lilies, which were fragrant and beautiful, and sometimes it could be sunflowers or stars. Now, there was a calla lily on the table. Shenmanting glanced at it, then sat down with the baby in her arms and lifted her clothes to feed the baby. Shenmanting seemed a little embarrassed with her back to Shenluo. The baby stopped after a few breaths, then closed his eyes and continued to sleep. "Go to the room and change your clothes. I'll get you pajamas." Shenluo turned and went into the only room in the house. Shenmanting looked around and found that there was indeed only one room. There was only one room. Did Shenluo want to sleep with her? She was shocked and stood up subconsciously. She wanted to leave with the baby in her arms. Enough. She had enough of that kind of life. Now that the baby was just born, she couldn't support him at all. Shenmanting suddenly regretted it. I shouldn't have. She shouldn't have agreed to go with him at the hospital. Now, he had merely moved from the cage of the imperial capital to another cage. Her heart trembled, and she got up to open the door. When Shenluo walked out with a set of clean pajamas, he saw Shenmanting trying to open the door. His face darkened, and he quickly stepped forward and roared, "It's already so late, what are you trying to do?" Shenmanting froze when she heard that. Then, he opened the door and walked out. However, Shenluo was obviously faster. He stepped forward and grabbed her hand, saying, "Behave yourself. It's very windy outside. If you catch a cold and fall ill, I won't be the one suffering." Shenmanting froze and turned to look at him. It was hard to imagine that Shenluo was the one who had said those words. Shen Luo and felt a little uncomfortable under her gaze. He pulled her inside and locked the door. He threw the pajamas to her and said, "Change your clothes and go rest. What do you want to eat? I'll go buy it for you." Chapter 1953. Shen Luo and acted as if he didn't see her and pushed her into the room. "Where do you want to change?" Shen Manting finally reacted. She glanced at the child in her arms and walked into the room with the pajamas in her hands. She locked the door and made sure that it couldn't be opened from the outside before she put the baby down. Shen Manting looked around the room. The room was decorated very simply. She could tell that it had just been moved in. After changing into a new set of clothes, Shen Manting found that the room was warm and cozy. She touched the wall and found that it wasn't cold. She lay down and found that the soft bed was very comfortable. Shen Manting stretched her back comfortably. She was overcome by waves of sleepiness. She hadn't felt this way for a long time. She closed her eyes and fell asleep unknowingly. Shen Manting didn't know how long she had slept and was awakened by a knock on the door. The baby was still asleep. Shen Manting got up and suddenly remembered that she was no longer in the hospital. She opened the door and saw Shen Luo and standing at the door. Seeing Shen Manting's sleepy look, Shen Luo and sighed and said, "Come out and eat." "I'm not hungry." Shen Manting looked at him. "I just want to sleep." "Sleep after eating." Shen Luo and pulled her up and looked down at her feet. "Put on your shoes." Shen Manting glanced at it and turned around. She only saw a pair of shoes that she had just put on. Shen Luo and saw it and walked into the room. He took out a pair of cotton shoes from a corner and threw them on the ground. "Put them on." Shen Manting felt a little strange. After putting them on, she walked out obediently. Shen Luo and threw a warm towel to her and said, "Wipe your hands." Then, he scooped her soup. The soup pot was a clay pot and seemed to be a little heavy. Did Shen Luo and bring it back like this? The strange feeling in Shen Manting's heart became stronger. She took a sip of the soup. It was Crucian carp soup. It was delicious and sweet. But it was a little hot. Shen Manting couldn't help but take another sip and soon finished the bowl of soup. Looking at the empty bowl, Shen Manting smacked her lips and felt a little unsatisfied. "Eat." Shen Luo and glanced at her and said, "Don't eat too much." The rice pot was next to him. It seemed that Shen Luo and had steamed the rice himself. "Did you make this soup?" Shen Manting's instincts told her that it was impossible. Shen Luo and was used to being pampered since he was a child. He had a nanny at home and was loved by his family. He had never had the chance to cook for himself. Sure enough, Shen Luo and laughed when he heard this. "How is that possible?" "Oh." Shen Manting felt relieved. Fortunately, if it was really made by Shen Luo and she was afraid that eating it would shorten her lifespan. Shen Luo and looked at her. He didn't know whether he should explain or not, so he said, "I asked the aunt next door to do it. I told her that my wife had just given birth, so I hired her to take care of you for a month." Shen Manting almost choked on her food. His wife. Shen Luo and patted her on the back. She didn't know what he was feeling, but he continued, "She'll be officially taking you with her tomorrow." "How much money?" "Not much." Shen Manting lowered her head and murmured, "I'll return it to you." Shen Luo An's expression darkened again. He retracted his hand without saying a word. Shen Manting didn't dare to speak. She picked up her chopsticks and ate without hesitation. The food was obviously made for pregnant women. There was little salt and oil, and it was very light. Chapter 1954. Enchanting hadn't had a full meal for a long time. The hospital fees were too expensive. She had been staying in the hospital since a few days before her due date. During this period of time, she had to scrimp and save to raise the child. Therefore, she didn't dare to eat or use good food. She had prepared herself for the worst. If she really couldn't afford to raise the child, she would find an old man to marry. No matter what, she had to keep the child alive first. She didn't expect Shenluo to come. While eating, Enchanting suddenly felt a little sad. She lowered her head and drank the last mouthful of soup. She stood up and said, "I'm full. Call me when you're done. I'll wash the dishes. I'll go see the baby first." Shenluo looked up and saw that Enchanting's eyes were a little red. He didn't say anything and watched Enchanting walk in. Enchanting wiped her eyes and then looked at her son. Although his facial features were not fully developed, it could be seen that he looked very much like Shenluo. Enchanting gently squeezed his little hand and smiled slightly. "I bought milk powder and diapers. They're in the cabinet." Shenluo's voice came in, followed by the sound of footsteps. "I'll be outside. Call me if you're busy." Shenluo stood at the door and looked at her. "I know you're afraid of me. I'll sleep in the living room." Enchanting's heart seemed to be hit by a few simple words. An inexplicable feeling suddenly arose. Looking at Shenluo, Enchanting nodded. Shenluo stared at Enchanting for a long time. He wanted to say something, but he didn't. After looking at her for a while, he turned and walked out. He even closed the door behind him. Enchanting opened the cabinet and looked at it. It was full of paper diapers, all of which were of good brands. Her heart ached slightly, and she silently calculated the price. She opened the cabinet next to it, which was full of milk powder. The milk powder in the gold can was of a German brand. It was very expensive at first glance. Enchanting suddenly felt a little tempted. She couldn't afford to give him these things. But Shenluo could. If the child were to live with Shenluo, at the very least, the child would be able to eat and dress well. The child wouldn't have to be as strapped for money as she was. Moreover, Shenluo and the old lady really wanted this child. Enchanting's eyes darkened as she looked at the little boy sleeping on the bed. Yes, they wanted this child. But he wouldn't want her. No matter how nicely they put it, it was just a means to take the child away. Once she handed over the child, what awaited her was probably a large sum of money. Or perhaps, it was Shenluo's endless abuse and violation. He loved Yi Yuyu, yet he married Guan Kui. Yet, he spent every night with her. Shenluo had never treated her as a human being. To him, she was just a tool to satisfy his lust. Now, Yi Yuyu was with Li Jinan, and Guan Kui had committed suicide. Coincidentally, she was pregnant, so Shenluo extended his evil claws to her. Enchanting instantly became alert and straightened up. Don't be fooled by him. Shenluo was not a human being. She couldn't even believe that he would really treat the child well. Her heart was beating fast and heavy, and she suddenly felt lucky to have survived a disaster. She almost fell into the trap. Chapter 1955. The baby suddenly struggled and opened his mouth to cry. She touched his little butt and found that something was wrong, so she changed his diaper. She couldn't sleep until the middle of the night, when she finally fell asleep. The baby woke up a few times in the middle of the night. Enchanting didn't sleep well. The next day, she was woken up by a noise. She got up and opened the door. Shenluo had just woken up. Did you sleep well? Shenluo looked at her. It's time to eat. As Shenluo spoke, his gaze shifted to her bed. Shenmanting was a little wary. She blocked his view and nodded. I know. Shenluo looked at her deeply and said, I want to see the baby. He's still asleep. Don't disturb him, Shenmanting whispered as she blocked the door. Shenluo seemed a little unhappy, but he didn't say anything. He turned around and left. After a while, Shenmanting walked out in her cotton shoes. Shenluo looked up and was a little disappointed when he saw that she didn't come out with the baby. A middle-aged woman sitting next to her saw that Shenmanting was only wearing pajamas. She exclaimed, How can you wear so little? What if you catch a cold? No, go put on a coat. As she spoke, she pushed Shenluo and said, Hurry up and get your wife some clothes. Shenmanting became alert and said, No need. I'll get it myself. You're still in confinement. Don't walk around. Just sit here, the middle-aged woman said. Auntie rebuked, Men are meant to be ordered around. You've already done it, so why are you asking your man to do it? Shenmanting gritted her teeth and said, But he's not, sit down. Shenluo glanced at her. I'll get it. As he spoke, he stood up and walked toward the room. He opened the door and took out a down jacket from yesterday. He couldn't help but stop in front of the bed. He squatted down and looked at the well-behaved and delicate baby. At first glance, the baby's features were so similar to his. Unconsciously, a sense of satisfaction arose in his heart. Shenluo gently reached out his finger and touched the baby's little face. The baby was still sleeping and didn't feel anything. Shenluo felt that his whole life was complete. He couldn't help but grin. Shenmanting waited outside for a long time. She had a bad feeling about this. Just as he was about to stand up, he heard footsteps coming from inside. Shenluo came over with a down jacket and said, Put this on. Then, she looked at the auntie and said, Auntie Lin, it's time to eat. Hey, you're here. Auntie Lin brought out the freshly cooked porridge and said, A woman's vitality will be greatly damaged after giving birth. You must nourish yourself. Shenmanting couldn't help but poke her head out to take a look. At a glance, she saw an unknown piece of meat floating inside. Along with a few pieces of vegetables, the appearance was really a little embarrassing. However, it smelled pretty good. Aunt Lin served Shenmanting a bowl and said, Here, try it. What is this? Shenmanting took a sniff but couldn't tell what it was. Auntie Lin did not say anything and said, Try it first. Shenmanting took a sip and said, It's sweet and fresh. Does it taste good? Not bad. Aunt Lin smiled and said, Eat more if you like it. Come, there's more in the pot. Shenmanting had a good appetite. She drank 2 bowls at once and said, It's delicious. What meat is this? It's quite smooth. Is it frog meat? Chapter 1956. Snake, meat? When Shenmanting heard this word, she suddenly felt her stomach churn. She felt nauseous. She stood up and covered her mouth, wanting to leave. Aunt Lin immediately held her down and said, Don't vomit. Snake meat is very nutritious. Come and drink some water. But Shenmanting couldn't control herself. Aunt Lin directly pressed her down and said, You also think it's delicious. It's good for your health and milk. No matter what, you have to swallow it. Shenmanting looked at her uncomfortably, but when she heard Aunt Lin's words, she still forced herself to swallow it. Shenmanting took a sip of the water that was handed to her. After a while, she felt much better. But when she saw the porridge in the pot in front of her, she felt uncomfortable. The baby was crying inside. Enchanting immediately got up and walked inside. When feeding, Enchanting didn't know if it was an illusion, but she felt that the baby was eating better today. Did the 2 bowls of snake meat really work? She thought to herself, but she still felt very uncomfortable. No matter what, if she was asked to eat the snake meat again, she would definitely not eat it again. After the baby finished feeding, Enchanting changed his diaper, and the baby fell asleep again. Enchanting felt helpless and amused at the same time. She whispered, just like a little pig. Suddenly, she heard footsteps, followed by a knock on the door. There was no doubt that it was Enchanting. Can I come in? No. Enchanting thought. I want to see the baby. Hearing this, Enchanting subconsciously looked at the little baby in her arms. This face was very similar to his. If Enchanting saw it, would he be more determined to keep the baby? Enchanting was hesitating, but she heard the sound of the door being opened. Enchanting was wearing casual home clothes, and his angular temperament seemed to have softened a lot. He looked down at Enchanting and said, "Are you asleep again?" She didn't know if it was an illusion, but she knew he was asking about the baby. But a pair of eyes were looking at her. Inexplicably, she suddenly felt her heart suddenly jump. The turbulent feeling came suddenly, and Enchanting immediately lowered her head. She glanced at the sleeping baby and replied, "He's asleep." Enchanting walked forward and looked at the swaddle. "Can I hold him?" Enchanting looked up and saw the desire and inquiry in his eyes. Enchanting's heart fluttered, and she found it impossible to refuse. Enchanting. He seemed to have changed. She hesitated for a moment before pushing the child forward and saying, "Be careful. Don't hurt the baby." When Enchanting saw that she had agreed, he was overjoyed, and a sincere smile appeared on his face. She reached out with both hands and gently picked up the child. The fragrant smell of milk and the soft, warm swaddling clothes were in his arms. Enchanting felt his heartbeat quicken. It was very clear. His gaze swept across the child in his arms. Those eyebrows and those eyes were so similar to his own. Enchanting felt a sense of satisfaction that he hadn't felt for a long time. He asked, "Have you thought of a name for the baby?" Enchanting wasn't in the mood to name the baby. She suddenly remembered when Enchanting mentioned it. She looked at the baby's pink and tender cheeks and shook her head gently. "Well, let me think." Chapter 1957. He's going to name the baby. Enchanting was shocked. She suddenly felt annoyed that someone was coveting her things. She frowned and reached out her hand, saying, "Give me the baby." As she spoke, she took the baby in her arms. Enchanting's voice was a little heavy. No matter how stupid Enchanting was, he could see that this woman was angry. Enchanting pursed his lips and frowned. Seeing Enchanting's vigilant look, his good mood suddenly sank to the bottom. His gentle eyes became colder. "Enchanting, what do you mean?" Enchanting's voice was not loud, but the anger hidden in it was obvious. Enchanting heard this and shrank back. She looked up and saw Enchanting's angry face. She lowered her head and said coldly, "The baby is afraid of strangers. He will cry later." "Afraid of strangers?" Enchanting suddenly laughed. "You can make up a better excuse if you want to brush me off." "Afraid of strangers? He's only been born for a few days and you're telling me he's afraid of strangers?" Enchanting did not speak but hugged the baby tighter in her arms. The baby was hers. The baby was hers. Even if he was the baby's biological father, she would not allow him to take him away. Enchanting did not say these words out loud. She held the baby in her arms, but her heart was not at all confident. Shen Luoban's tone was not light, but Shen Manting's silence made him feel that it was meaningless. She gritted her teeth, stood up, and turned to leave. She closed the door, making a sound that was neither light nor heavy. The baby seemed to feel something, but it seemed that he did not notice anything. He pursed his lips, and then his breathing returned to normal. Looking at the closed door, Shen Manting's eyes were sore and her breathing stagnated. Her heart seemed to be hit hard by something. She looked up at the ceiling above her head. The room was quiet. February 1st, cloudy. I don't know where Shen Luoban went, but Aunt Lin is still here to take care of me and the baby. I know that I must have angered him yesterday, and he did not come back last night. Thank God, I can finally take care of the baby and have a good night's sleep. I hope he forgets me and doesn't come again. February 8th, sunny. Shen Luoban left for a week and never came back. Thanks to Aunt Lin's care, I could feel my body getting better and better. The baby was awake more and more. Sometimes, he could open his eyes and look at me. He was very satisfied. Baby, Mommy loves you. February 13th, rain. The baby was half a month old. Shen Luoban was back. He looked much thinner than before. He had dinner at home, but he didn't say a word to me. He just came to see the baby. She didn't offer to hug me, which made me feel strange. He went out again, and I had a feeling he was going to do something that would make me very uncomfortable. Hopefully, I'm just overthinking things. He finally thought of a name for the baby, Shen Yueshao. Yu as in surpassing, Shao as in ambitious and ruthless, surpassing ambitious and ruthless. Shen Manting closed her diary. Little Moon, who was sitting next to her, was staring at her with his beautiful, dark eyes. Suddenly, he opened his mouth and yawned. Her face was flushed, and she clenched her fists as she looked at Shen Manting's innocent and ignorant look. Shen Manting's lips curled into a smile. She picked up the infant and whispered, Shen Yueshao, Shen Yueshao. Do you like this name? Chapter 1958. Shen Manting's body stiffened and she turned her head to look. Shen Luoban was covered in dust. It was obvious that he had just come in. His eyes were a little red. He stood outside and looked in through the crack of the door. Shen Manting was shocked and reached out to close the door. However, Shen Luoban blocked the door and squeezed his way in. As soon as he came in, Shen Manting smelled the alcohol on him. After a sniff, Shen Manting was alarmed. She was shocked and shrank back with the child in her arms. She asked warily, "Did you drink?" Shen Luoban narrowed his eyes and looked a little lazy. His eyes were very red. He looked at her with a pair of indescribable eyes. Shen Manting became more and more uneasy. She stepped back and said, "Get out of the way. The baby is still here." When Shen Luoban heard this, he seemed to be a little sober and took a step back. He took off his coat and hung it up. Then, he walked over slowly. Shen Manting was shocked and unconsciously shrank to the corner of the wall. "What are you afraid of?" Shen Luoban looked down at her with slightly red eyes. "I won't eat you." Shen Manting looked at him and frowned. "Which you? Which Shao?" Shen Manting was stunned and couldn't react for a moment. "Didn't you name the baby?" Shen Manting was silent for a moment and answered, "Yes, Yu as in surpassing and Shao as in ambitious." "Ambitious?" Shen Luoban suddenly laughed. Shen Manting was bewildered by his laughter. She had no idea what he was laughing at. "This word is too fierce. You'd better change it." "Fierce?" "Yes." Shen Luoban responded and moved his eyes to the child in Shen Manting's arms. "I asked Grandma to predict this child's fate. Hearing this, Enchanting was shocked and then annoyed. You're the one who has a bad life. Enchanting glanced at her face and said in a low voice, I don't believe it either, but Grandma said that his health may not be very good. If he follows you, he is very likely to die. You're talking nonsense. Enchanting was angry. Don't try to lie to me. Even if you want this child, you have to make up a better reason. Enchanting's face darkened, and he said, if I wanted you to hand the child over to me, I would snatch him away directly. You wouldn't be able to do anything about it. Enchanting's voice trailed off, and she gritted her teeth in silence. Look at you now. You don't have money or power. The only thing you have is your face. Now that you've ruined it like this, what do you have to fight me with? Enchanting looked at her and said with contempt, look in the mirror. You don't even have the capital to sell yourself now. Enchanting's words were too straightforward. His words stabbed straight into Enchanting's heart, and her face instantly turned pale. What, you can't accept it? Enchanting looked at her and smiled sarcastically. I'm telling you the truth. Don't think too highly of yourself. Chapter 1959. Enchanting. The words were squeezed out from the gaps between his teeth. Enchanting's eyes were bloodshot as he glared at her. She felt a chill run down her spine. However, after staring at him for a long time, he finally sneered. Enchanting was even more furious, and his grip on her hand tightened. Enchanting closed her eyes and hugged the baby tighter. Seeing her like this, Enchanting suppressed his anger and flung his hand away in exasperation. I'm going to take a shower. I dare you to lock the door. With that, he kicked the door open and walked out. There were no lights on outside, so it was pitch black. Enchanting immediately stood up, closed the door, and locked it. Enchanting turned off the lights and lay on the bed with the child in her arms. Enchanting, who was outside, heard the commotion inside. The anger in his heart somehow dissipated. He stared at the darkness around him and took a deep breath. It seemed like a sigh, but it wasn't. Childish. Enchanting took a shower and took out the keys from the drawer. He opened the door and walked in. Enchanting was breastfeeding the baby, and the lights were off in the room. Enchanting was startled when she heard the door open. She looked up and saw that Enchanting had already turned on the lights. When he saw Enchanting looking as if she had seen a ghost, he sneered and threw the key onto the bedside table. He took off his shoes, lifted the blanket, and was about to lie down. Enchanting was even more shocked. She bounced up and roared, "What do you want to do? Let's sleep." Enchanting was not ashamed at all. He glanced outside and said, "It's cold outside. It's warmer inside." Enchanting sucked on the baby's breasts, revealing his fair belly. Enchanting glanced at it and felt his body heat up. Feeling a little thirsty, he turned his head away and said, "If you're done, then go to sleep. I won't do anything to you." As he spoke, he had already laid down. Enchanting tilted her body slightly and felt her hair stand on end. She looked at him and said, "Then you sleep here. I'll sleep somewhere else." His tone was filled with lingering fear, and his voice was trembling with unwillingness. Enchanting's face darkened. He got out of bed and locked the door. "Sleep here." Enchanting felt as if her heart was being pierced, and she felt extremely uncomfortable. She gritted her teeth and looked at him. Then, she glanced at the infant. After standing there for a while, he felt a chill. The first month was definitely not a warm day. When the child was full of milk, Enchanting couldn't take it anymore. It was very cold. "Give it to me." Enchanting reached out and glanced at Little Moon. She glanced at him, then sat down on the edge of the bed with the child in her arms. Shen Luo and didn't care. He reached out and took the baby in his arms. Shen Manting was shocked. Just as she was about to speak, she caught a glimpse of Shen Luo and's inexplicably happy face. For some strange reason, he loosened his grip and the baby was carried away. Little Moon had been born for more than half a month. This was the second time Shen Luo and had a child in his arms. Compared to the last time, the little doll was obviously heavier. Although the increase was not significant, Shen Luo and could clearly sense the changes. Shen Luo An's eyes crinkled, and his heart melted. He whispered, "Daddy's little darling." Shen Manting's heart fluttered, and it felt as if it had suddenly been squeezed. Shen Luo An's face was gentle, and he looked very much like an elegant gentleman. Chapter 1960. However, only his family knew what he really looked like. No, perhaps, only Shen Manting knew the true face of this man. Shen Luo and looked very gentle as he held the baby. He looked different from when he was facing her. He was playing with the baby, but the baby didn't respond at all. However, Shen Luo and didn't seem to feel bored at all. Instead, he looked very happy. "Say something else," Shen Luo and suddenly said. Shen Manting was stunned and looked at him. "What?" Shen Yue Shao. Shao as in brave and good at fighting. Shen Luo and held the baby in his arms and the smile on his face gradually disappeared. He looked at Shen Manting and said, "Shao as in ambitious and fierce." His tone sounded like he was asking for Shen Manting's opinion, but it didn't seem like it. For a moment, Shen Manting suddenly couldn't understand this man's attitude. Facing his gaze, Shen Manting had an indescribable feeling. She slightly avoided his gaze and then responded. "Okay." Shen Luo An's expression softened and he said, "Go to sleep. It's getting late." He carefully placed the baby in the middle of the bed. The bed was very big. It was 2 meters long and was enough for 2 people to lie down. Shen Luo An fell asleep. She didn't know whether he did it intentionally or not, but his whole body shrank to the corner. Not to mention the distance between Shen Manting and the baby, there was still some distance between him and Shen Manting. Shen Manting's heart, which had been silent for a long time, suddenly jumped. Looking at him, Shen Luo An had already closed his eyes. Is he afraid of scaring me? After a long time, she got up and turned off the light. She lifted the quilt, lay down, and closed her eyes. However, the sleepiness just now seemed to be an illusion. Shen Manting couldn't fall asleep no matter how hard she tried. Her mind was full of Shen Luo An. He was clearly sleeping beside her, but he kept messing around in her mind. Shen Manting didn't know how long she kept her eyes open, but she felt sleepy again. However, the baby next to her suddenly moved, and then there was a small cry. Shen Manting reached out and gently patted the baby. She softly coaxed, "Little Moon, be good. Don't cry." The baby really quieted down. Shen Manting yawned and closed her eyes. After sleeping for a few minutes, the baby woke up again. The moment she opened her mouth, she began to cry. Her small hands and feet flailed about restlessly. Shen Manting swept him over and tested his diaper. When she didn't find anything strange, she lifted his shirt and started breastfeeding him. Shen Manting kept her eyes closed throughout the entire process. Habitual and numb. However, he didn't seem to be impatient at all. Shen Luo An witnessed everything in the dark. He looked at her with a burning gaze. Shen Manting didn't notice anything. After feeding him milk, Shen Manting put down her clothes and soon fell into a deep sleep. Shen Luo An closed his eyes again, but he didn't sleep for long before the baby woke up again. It wasn't easy to raise a child. Shen Luo and finally experienced it. The baby woke up 5 or 6 times in one night. Every time Shen Manting woke up, she would either feed him or change his diaper. Every time he switched on the lights, his eyes would be blinded. Shen Manting felt an indescribable joy in her heart when she saw it. She unconsciously slowed down the process of changing the baby's diaper. Chapter 1961. Needless to say, Shen Manting slept even less than him. But his biological clock forced him to wake up at this time. Shen Luo and couldn't fall asleep no matter how hard he tried. It was 6:30 in the morning. Shen Manting was still asleep. Shen Luo and yawned, got up quietly, and went to the bathroom. He looked in the mirror and saw 2 dark circles under his eyes. What a mess. But he was so happy. He stared at the mirror for a long time and suddenly laughed. Are you crazy, Shen Luofen? He reached out and tapped the mirror, then washed up. Shen Manting slept until 9 o'clock. She reached out and touched the front, but it was empty. He opened his eyes abruptly and saw that the seat beside him had long since been empty. He quickly got up and ran outside barefoot. She saw the man sitting on the sofa. Shen Luo and was holding a diaper in his hand, and he didn't know what to do. The baby was placed next to him. His little butt was bare, and there was a thick cotton pad under him. Shen Manting's heart, which had been clenched tightly, suddenly relaxed. She quickly walked up and looked at Shen Luo and, saying, "The baby will catch a cold like this. But he's pooped. I have to change it." Shen Luo and frowned and handed the diaper to Shen Manting. Shen Manting saw it and took it. Shen Luo unconsciously moved away, and Shen Manting took his place. She looked at the baby and found that his little butt was clean. Shen Manting had an ominous premonition in her heart and asked, "What did you use to clean his wound?" "Wipe?" Shen Luo An's face lit up with realization. "So that's what you usually do. What else?" Shen Manting was even more shocked. "Don't tell me you washed him directly in the water." Shen Luo and heard this and suddenly felt a little guilty, but he didn't say anything. Shen Manting was annoyed and hit him with the clean diaper. "What if he catches a cold?" "Go away." She looked angry, then turned around and quickly put the diaper on the baby. Shen Manting's action was so rough that Shen Luo couldn't react for a moment. In the blink of an eye, Shen Manting was busy. This feeling was a little strange. Shen Luo actually thinks it's not bad. He looked at Shen Manting, who hadn't even washed up yet. His face was pale, and he looked extremely slovenly. In all fairness, this Shen Manting was uglier than any other state he had seen before. Inexplicably, Shen Luo was in a good mood. Shen Manting quickly wrapped the baby up. Then, she quickly picked him up and said, "Don't bathe the baby in the future. It'll be troublesome if he catches a cold." Shen Luo didn't reply. He looked at the baby in his arms. Shen Manting also realized that she might have been a little too fierce and said uncomfortably, "I'll go wash my face first." "Why isn't Aunt Lin here?" "I told her to rest today." Shen Luo stood up. "What do you want to eat?" "I'll go buy it." Shen Manting asked, "Is the food outside edible?" Chapter 1962. Shen Manting glanced at it and saw that it was a can of tonic. It belonged to the category of health supplements. The words on it were very conspicuous: postpartum supplement. In other words, it was specially bought for her. Shen Luo handed it to her. He looked at her slightly absent-minded face and felt a sense of satisfaction in his heart. He turned around and said, "Wait for me to come back." After leaving these words, Shen Luo opened the door and walked out. Enchanting looked at his back and suddenly realized what was going on. She seemed to be more and more relaxed around him. February 14th, sunny. Shenluo and seems to be different. He seems to be sincere to the child. But what should I do? The days passed peacefully, and Enchanting slowly got used to Shenluo An's existence. Shenluo and seemed to be really different from before. At the very least, he didn't do anything out of line every single day he was here. It was another morning. When Enchanting opened her eyes, she saw a large sleeping face. Shenluo and gently placed his hand on her body and circled it around her and the baby. The baby's position was perfectly empty in the middle, and the baby was well protected. But even so, it still gave her a fright. Enchanting subconsciously shrank back a little. This shrinkage not only woke Shenluo up, but also startled the baby. The baby moved a little, then opened his mouth and cried. Enchanting quickly patted him, and after a while, the baby became quiet again. But when she looked up, she saw a pair of deep and hazy eyes. Enchanting subconsciously held her breath and looked at him. Morning, Shenluo said, then stretched and said, it seems that Aunt Lin is here. I'll go and see. Shenluo never procrastinated when he got up. Enchanting looked at the other half of the bed in front of her, slightly absent-minded. His mind buzzed, and many questions popped up one after another. Why did he sleep with me in his arms? More importantly, she didn't feel it at all. The ominous feeling in her heart grew stronger, and Enchanting was a little annoyed. Shenluo invaded her world day by day, and she had slowly become used to him. However, it was impossible for Shenluo to have the patience to play house with her and play the role of the husband of this nameless family of 3. His target was definitely the baby. Once she let her guard down, he could snatch the child away, right? The more he thought about it, the more terrifying it was. Enchanting broke out in a cold sweat because of her own thoughts. This situation was too terrifying. However, he had to be on guard. Shenluo could really do such a thing. Enchanting also got up to wash up, but she looked a little absent-minded. When he came out, the baby had already been carried out. Shenluo sat on the sofa and fed the baby. The baby held the bottle with both hands and sucked contentedly. The feeling in Enchanting's heart suddenly became stronger. She looked at them, walked over, and said, let me do it. However, Shenluo was unwilling to do so. He said, there's no need for that. Go and have breakfast first. I'll take your turn later. He had a silly smile on his face. Enchanting hesitated for a moment but didn't say anything. She turned around to eat breakfast. Suddenly, Shenluo, who was sitting on the sofa, laughed and said, look, our son is smiling at me. Chapter 1963. He didn't notice that Enchanting's body stiffened slightly when he said our son. Shenluo walked over with the baby in his arms and crouched down. But soon, there was a look of regret on his face and he said, he's not smiling anymore. Aunt Lin heard this and was amused. She rebuked, how can such a small baby know how to smile? He'll smile with you when he grows up. Enchanting glanced at him and her body tensed up. The strange feeling in her heart magnified and got out of hand. But Shenluo didn't notice it. He held the baby with a look of regret on his face. He seemed to notice that Enchanting was looking at him, and he looked up at her. Enchanting looked at him and quickly looked away. She said, do you want to eat? You eat first. I'll hold the baby. Shenluo sat down next to her with the baby in his arms and said, have you noticed that the baby has become more and more good-looking recently? Look at his face. It's much rounder. Aunt Lin looked a little proud and said, of course. Mom has good food and drinks, and the baby has enough nutrition. Of course, he's become good-looking. Shenluo and grinned and said, that's true. I'll give you a bonus later. The smile on Aunt Lin's face blossomed as she said, thank you, sir. Everything seemed to be harmonious. Shenmanting's heart, which she had finally calmed down in the morning, suddenly began to waver again. February 28, sunny. Her confinement was finally over. She couldn't wait to take a shower, wash her hair, and change into new clothes. She felt that she finally looked like a human. Ha ha ha. I'm going to take a walk on the street. I'm going to take little Moon out to bask in the sun. The outside world, here I come. Shenluo especially bought a small cart, but Shenmanting didn't feel comfortable leaving the baby alone in the cart, so the cart was fortunately left unused. It was the first time Shenmanting took the baby out, so she didn't dare to go far. The sun was not small outside, but because it was early spring, it wasn't so hot. The baby opened his eyes and habitually frowned under the sun. He frowned slightly and thought of Shenluo An's unhappy look. Shenmanting held the little guy in her arms and smiled. Shenluo An reached out a hand to cover the baby's face and said, don't get sunburned. I'm covering you, Shenmanting said with a smile as she arched her body slightly to shield the infant from the sun. Little Moon's skin is tender. It'll be terrible if he gets sunburned. Shenmanting glared at him angrily and said, the sun is so strong. Who will die from the heat? Why don't you use an umbrella? Wait for me. I'll go buy an umbrella, Shenluo An said before disappearing. Soon he came back with an umbrella in his hand. It was still spring, and the weather had been a little humid recently. The sunlight in Jiangnan was not that strong. However, Shenluo An's concern for the baby left her speechless. Under the curious gazes of the passers-by, he finally walked a full circle. Shenmanting was in a much better mood. For the past month, he had been cooped up in a small room all day. He was bored to death. But because the infant couldn't be left outside for too long, Shenmanting still carried him home. Aunt Lin had already prepared lunch. When she saw them return, she said, you're back. You can eat now. Chapter 1964. The baby was very obedient. Shenmanting washed her hands, scooped some rice, and sat down. Shenluo An did the same. He quickly sat down beside her. Delicious dishes were placed in front of them. The two of them sat next to each other, but Shenmanting did not move away. Even Shenmanting didn't realize that she had become more and more tolerant of Shenluo An over the past month. Shenluo An glanced at her and smiled. That, sir, Aunt Lin wiped her hands with her apron. There was already a thin layer of sweat on her face. When he spoke, Shenmanting and Shenluo An looked at him. Aunt Lin looked a little apologetic and said, you see, Manting is out of confinement now. I promised to take care of her until then. I won't be coming tomorrow. Shenmanting was shocked and asked, why are you in such a hurry? Yes. Aunt Lin looked apologetic. My daughter is about to give birth. She has been nagging me for the past few days. Shenluo An frowned. Shenmanting also felt that it was a little sudden. Aunt Lin's cooking was good, and she was kind. Most importantly, she was attentive. For the past month, she had been teaching him. His mother was supposed to do all the postpartum chores, but Aunt Lin did it all. There was no doubt that Shenmanting was reluctant to tell them that she was leaving. Seeing their reaction, Auntie Lin said, I agreed to work for a month, not only because Sir offered a high salary, but also because it's a suitable time for my daughter. Aren't you going back to the capital? Why don't I help you go back to the capital? Just in a few days. What do you think? Back to the imperial capital. Shenmanting's heart skipped a beat and she subconsciously glanced at Shenluoven. Shenluoven didn't seem surprised at all. He nodded and said, "All right. Thank you for all this time, Aunt Lin." Aunt Lin finally heaved a sigh of relief and said, Of course, of course." Soon, Aunt Lin left. After he left, no matter how delicious the food was, Shenmanting felt that it was tasteless. Back to the imperial capital. She was not going back. However, Shenluoven was from the capital. Over the past month, other than going back a few times, he spent most of his time here. He couldn't stay in Jiangnan for the rest of his life, right? Shenmanting felt vexed. It was supposed to be a happy day, but why couldn't he be happy? If you don't want to go back, you can wait. Shenluoven said, "The baby is a month old. I've already told my parents about the registration. Register me in your household register?" Shenmanting looked at him with a reluctant expression on her face. Shenluoven put down his chopsticks and said, "My parents and grandma are looking forward to seeing Little Moon. Ever since the baby was born, they've said more than once that they wanted to visit you and their grandson." Shenmanting's expression darkened. "But I was afraid that you wouldn't agree, and I didn't want to scare you, so I didn't let them come." Shenluoven looked at her. "They're old. This is their first grandchild." "I'm not young either," Shenmanting said in a low voice. "This is my first child. You're also my first." Shenluoven's gaze softened. "Manting, come back with me." "Go back." Shenmanting sneered. "Like a parasite, I'll be imprisoned and raped by you." Shenmanting's eyes had turned red, and her eyes were filled with obvious hatred. Chapter 1965. Really? Shenmanting slammed her chopsticks on the table. "Is this how you talk to me nicely?" Shenluoven glanced at the chopstick she had slammed down and said with a sullen face, "Do you have to talk to me like this?" Her anger quickly spread. Shenluoven's whole body seemed to be stained with cold air as he glared at her. Shenmanting looked at Shenluoven and naturally thought of the man in front of her as the Shenluoven who used to treat her like an ant and a sex slave. She sneered and said sarcastically, "Yes, this is Shenluoven." Shenluoven narrowed his eyes and asked, "What do you mean? You've been pretending for a month. Are you tired?" Shenmanting stood up and turned to leave. Shenluoven grabbed her hand and gritted his teeth. "No matter what your choice is, I'm going to have the child. I've been here for so long not to play house with you." Shenmanting felt a stab in her heart. She swung her hand back with a cold face. Shenluoven's grip on her hand tightened. "You've finally shown your true colors, haven't you?" Shenmanting gritted her teeth and looked at him with red eyes. "You can't pretend anymore, can you? You've finally shown your true colors, haven't you? In fact, you've been here for so long for Little Moon, for your son." Her voice was not soft and woke up Little Moon, who was sleeping soundly. The baby moved a little and then cried childishly. "Shenmanting." Shenluoven glanced in the direction of the baby and then threw her away. "Be polite. I've been with the child and you for the past month." "Ha!" Shenmanting took a step back. "You make it sound so good. Do you think I'll believe you?" Shenmanting. Shenluoven suppressed his anger and clenched his fists tightly. He walked up to her step by step and said, "I'm not staying just for the sake of the child. If you're willing, I can marry you." "Go to hell." Shenmanting roared and instantly erected all the barbs on her body like a hedgehog. "I'd rather marry a dog than marry you." You're a pervert who raped and humiliated your own sister. Shenluo and gritted his teeth and roared, Are you done? You know we have nothing to do with each other. Yes, it doesn't matter, Enchanting said with a laugh. That's why you could lock me up for so long and rape me every day without feeling guilty. That period of time was comparable to hell. She was almost blinded by Shenluo and during this period of time. But Shenluo and was Shenluo and. With just a little provocation from her, he revealed his true colors. Everything that had been laid out was just for the sake of this child. The corners of her lips twitched, and her vision blurred. Droplets of water rolled down her cheeks. Her heart felt like it had been drilled through a hole. She chuckled softly, That's why I have him. His finger pointed at the child. No one knows better than you how that little bastard came to be, brother. Bastard. Shenluo's hair stood on end when he heard such a sensitive word from her mouth. He looked at Enchanting in disbelief, as if he was looking at a lunatic. But the last word, brother, was a resounding slap on Shenluo's face. The baby cried even louder, as if it was crying out its mother's ruthless contempt. Chapter 1966. He was so strong that Enchanting immediately staggered. Her body fell hard on the sofa and she almost fell. She desperately tried to steady herself before she could stand. Shenluo's face was full of anger. His jaw was tight and the veins on his temples were bulging. He looked at Enchanting with obvious anger in his eyes. He grabbed the back of her neck and pressed her down, forcing her to look at the crying baby lying on the sofa. Look at your son and tell him that he's a bastard. His voice was not soft, and it was filled with rage. Enchanting's neck was pressed down hard. She looked at her son, whose face was red from crying, and desperately tried to push him away. But Shenluo was so strong that she couldn't move him no matter how hard she struggled. Tears fell uncontrollably. Let go of me. Enchanting tried to pull back, but she could only grab nothing. Her hands fluttered but couldn't touch anything. Her heart was terribly empty. The feeling of despair made her scream almost crazily. Shenluo, you beast. You're a pervert. Shenluo only felt that his anger was burning. He pressed her face in the direction of Little Moon. The baby seemed to be frightened and cried even harder. He had never cried like this before. The commotion attracted the attention of Aunt Lin, who lived next door. The door wasn't locked, so Aunt Lin easily came in. She was shocked to see the scene inside. She rushed forward and shouted, Sir, what are you doing? Enchanting has just finished her confinement. How can you fight? Shenluo's anger subsided a little when he heard someone else's voice. He loosened his grip slightly and Enchanting collapsed to the ground. Her neatly combed hair had all come loose. It stuck to her face and neck, looking miserable and disheveled. The new clothes she was wearing made Enchanting feel that the good feeling she had for the past month was a complete joke. Her tears were like a dam that had collapsed, gurgling down endlessly. She looked at the baby in front of her as if he had lost consciousness. His expression was empty and numb. The baby had never cried like this before, and his voice soon became hoarse. Aunt Lin felt sorry for him and went forward, saying, Poor child. But before she could touch him, she heard a broken scream. Don't touch him. Enchanting stood up like a madwoman and held the baby in her arms. Enchanting broke down in tears. She hugged the baby and burst into tears. Aunt Lin had no idea what had happened, but when she saw Enchanting in such a state, her heart ached and she was frightened. She looked at Shenluo blankly and asked, What happened? Why did they suddenly start fighting? Shenluo gritted his teeth and closed his eyes. She's crazy. You're the crazy one. Enchanting roared, "You're a lunatic. You've always been a lunatic, a devil, and a psychopath." Shenluo's face darkened as he walked forward. "Are you done scolding me?" Enchanting was frightened. She held the baby in her arms and retreated. She immediately turned around and ran into the room. Shenluo quickly caught up with her, but he was still a step too late. Enchanting seemed to have exhausted all her strength. She slammed the door shut and used her back to block it. "Ah!" Shenluo screamed in agony. Enchanting glanced at his fingers that were still in the gap of the door. She was startled and immediately loosened her grip. When she saw that he immediately withdrew his hand, she pressed it back down and quickly locked it. Bang! Bang! Chapter 1967. Shenluo's voice was very loud, and his hand was very heavy. Aunt Lin saw his bruised fingers and was shocked. She said, "Don't be too hard. You're scaring the baby. Don't scare Manting." Enchanting heard the noise outside and sneered. Then she looked at the window in the room. The window was not high and relatively spacious. There was a fence at the back, less than half a meter inside, with beautiful flowers and plants. Enchanting looked at the baby and put him down. She rummaged through her belongings, including her wallet, ID card, and bank card. She still had some savings from her previous job, which was enough to support her to find a new job and live for a while. She gritted her teeth and couldn't stop her tears from rolling down. Forget it. Her life would not be easy if she stayed here. Shenluo would also take her child away, and she would have to live an inhuman life again. She had just given birth, and he hadn't gotten the child yet. So Shenluo had a little conscience and didn't force her. When the child was in his hands and she let down her guard, he would not only get a child, but also a cheap sex slave. "I have to go." Shenluo was still banging on the door. Enchanting roared, "You're so noisy. Don't you think the baby is crying enough?" Sure enough, the other side soon quieted down. Enchanting calmed down a little. She took 2 bags of diapers and stuffed them into her big backpack. Then she placed the baby by the window and opened the window wide. She tried to be as gentle as possible. Suddenly, the sound of the door being unlocked came. Enchanting was shocked. She immediately pulled the baby over and held him firmly. She immediately crouched down. But it was too late. As soon as Shenluo came in, he saw Enchanting flash past the window. His anger, which had calmed down with great difficulty, surged again. Enchanting! Enchanting roared. Enchanting trembled and began to climb over the railing in a hurry with the baby in her arms. But the railing was a little high. Enchanting tried to climb over it, but she couldn't get over it, so she immediately trotted. Shenluo had already climbed out of the window and grabbed her backpack. Enchanting screamed and shouted, "Don't touch me. Get away." "Oh!" Shenluo uncovered her mouth and hugged her tightly from behind. Auntie Lin was on the verge of tears. He hurriedly ran out of the door and waited outside to receive them. Enchanting cried so hard that the infant's voice became hoarse. Auntie Lin stomped her feet in distress. "Give me the baby now. If you hurt the baby, you'll die of heartache." Enchanting's mouth was covered, but she cried even more desperately. She hugged the child tightly and refused to let go. He gritted his teeth, but in the end, he gave in and said, "We're not going back to the capital. We're not going back to the capital. Give the baby to Aunt Lin first. He's your son. Are you going to crush him to death?" Enchanting's eyes were red and swollen, and she slowly regained her composure. The baby's voice was hoarse, but he was still crying. Her face was so red that it was frightening. Enchanting was shocked. She quickly loosened her grip on him and handed him over. Aunt Lin hugged the baby and coaxed him. Little Moon gradually calmed down, perhaps because he was tired from crying. Enchanting also calmed down a little, but the passers-by would look at them a few times. An's expression was ugly, but he was much calmer than before. Chapter 1968. He looked down at Enchanting in front of him and tried to let go. Sure enough, Enchanting was no longer moving. However, her whole body seemed to have lost strength and softly collapsed. Aunt Lin was shocked and exclaimed, "Manting." And reacted quickly and immediately held her in his arms. However, the weight of such a big living person suddenly fell on and, coupled with the size of a person's backpack, made and stumble. "Enchanting." And called out uncertainly, then immediately picked her up and shouted, "Call the ambulance." Enchanting fainted suddenly without any warning. When and carried her back, he saw her eyes swollen like walnuts. Aunt Lin had taken care of Enchanting for a month. Although they were not very close, they still had some feelings for each other. Seeing them quarrel like this, she was anxious and distressed. She stomped her feet and scolded "A woman gave birth to your child. You can't do anything, no matter how serious the matter is. Manting is not very lively. It's not easy for her to get better and be more cheerful recently, but it's all because of you." Aunt Lin was about the same age as Mrs. and did not say a word in the face of her scolding. He sat down with Enchanting in his arms and pressed her face. "Hey, at least avoid the child when you quarrel. The baby is still so young. If he is scared, he may really be frightened. If anything happens to him, it's all your parents' fault." And felt even more annoyed, but he still pursed his lips and did not say a word. Auntie Lin finally managed to coax the baby to sleep. She sighed. The ambulance soon arrived. And put her on the stretcher and then took the baby. When she wakes up, she will probably look for the baby. "I'll take him with me." And looked at Aunt Lin and quickly got into the ambulance. After the doctor asked about the cause of the disease, he put Enchanting on N4. But after and explained the cause and effect, the doctor said, "The new mother's mood is unstable, and it may be postpartum depression. She has been avoiding you, and there is a 90% chance that it may be because of this." Yes. And was also a medical student, and he had vaguely guessed something. He was not surprised that Enchanting would suffer from postpartum depression. She had sealed herself up too tightly. Even the slightest bit of disturbance would feel like someone had touched her reverse scale. But during this period of time, Enchanting had obviously improved. However, just like what Aunt Lin had said, his violence had scared away all the improvements in her. And sat by the bed and covered his face with his hands. He sighed heavily. He was too impatient. He didn't have the confidence to take care of her and the child without Aunt Lin, so he couldn't wait to bring her back to the capital. Firstly, it was to let his parents see their son. Secondly, he wanted to give her and the child a proper status. The baby wanted to register, and so did she. But now, it was all destroyed. Woo! Woo, a baby's voice. And turned his head to the side. The baby was pouting and looked like he was about to cry. He picked up the baby and saw Enchanting twitching from the corner of his eye. She was startled and opened her eyes in an instant. There was an obvious fear on his face. After seeing him, the fear in her eyes intensified. Chapter 1969. Her movements were a little violent, and she tore the flexible tube of the infusion. Shenluo and clearly saw blood spurting out of the back of her hand. He was shocked and quickly handed the child over. Here. Don't be afraid. He didn't know if he was frightened by Shenmanting or for some other reason. The baby, who was about to cry, suddenly cried out. His voice had been hoarse from crying, and now it sounded helpless and miserable. Shenmanting's eyes also turned red, and she gently rubbed her face against her son's. Little Moon, don't cry. Shenluo and looked at the back of her hand and said, You're still on the infusion. Don't move. Get lost. Shenmanting shrank back, and half of the infusion needle that was stuck on her hand was lifted. The blood stained the back of her hand, and Shenluo's heart tightened. But he didn't lean over, and quickly pressed the call bell at the bedside. The nurse soon came over. When she saw the back of Shenmanting's hand, she frowned and came forward. She rebuked, How could you do this? Do you want to die? If your blood vessels rupture, how are you going to take care of your child? As she spoke, she had already picked up the medical equipment. He looked up and saw that Shenmanting was still holding the child. The nurse had a look of disdain on her face. She laughed and said, What are you looking at? Take the child away. Don't you see that your wife is bleeding? When Shenluo heard this, he moved forward a little. He tentatively reached out his hand, but Shenmanting held the baby tightly. The baby's miserable cries made his heart tremble. The nurse finally saw it. It wasn't that the man didn't want to hold the baby, but the woman didn't want to give it to him. You can hold the baby at any time. If your hand is crippled, you won't be able to hold the baby anymore. The nurse glanced at the back of her hand that had begun to drip blood. She secretly clicked her tongue and said, You really don't want this hand anymore. When your baby grows up and asks you how your hand is crippled, will you be able to tell him? Most of the words were threatening. But Shenmanting was still frightened. She slightly released the baby, and the crying became slightly softer. Shenluo hurried forward and carried the baby over. He gently coaxed the baby, looking like a good father and husband. Shenmanting found it ridiculous. She sneered and stretched out her hand. The blood dripped onto the blanket. The nurse frowned and said, Sigh, there was no need to dirty the blanket. Why did you have to quarrel in the hospital? Besides, the child is here. No matter how angry you are, you shouldn't throw a tantrum in front of the child. Don't think that the child doesn't know. They just don't understand, but they will remember it. Shenmanting and Shenluo remained silent. After the nurse was done, she applied the 4 drip on Shenmanting's other hand. Don't ruin it again. The last bag of water will be gone after we hang it up. Behave yourself. The nurse glanced at Shenluo and said, Look after your wife. There's only 1 bag left. Don't argue. Your wife's health is more important. Thank you, Shenluo said softly. When he looked back at Shenmanting, she was already lying down. The crying of the baby in her arms had stopped, and it was much quieter. Only a pair of watery eyes were still open. His dark round eyes resembled Shenmanting's. Are you hungry? I'll buy you some food. They didn't eat much during lunch. Shenmanting must be hungry after making such a fuss. But Shenmanting didn't respond. Shenluo suddenly came to his senses. Chapter 1970. As soon as this thought came to her, it was like a hook stuck in her heart, and she couldn't pull it out. Shenluo sat on the edge of the bed with Little Moon in his arms and said, I was wrong about what happened today. Shenmanting had already closed her eyes, but when she heard this, she suddenly tightened her grip on the quilt, and her knuckles turned slightly pale. I have a bad temper, but I'm trying to change it. Shenluo and rarely spoke in such a humble manner. Shenmanting's restless heart suddenly calmed down a little. The original fear, hatred, and disgust. With this soft voice, they all hid away as if they had seen a ghost. Shenmanting's heart ached slightly, but she still kept her eyes closed. She clearly heard Shenluo and take a deep breath and said, "I'll try not to lose my temper in the future. The baby may be hungry, give him some milk." Shenmanting's heart was suddenly calm, as if she had suddenly seen a ghost. It was extremely sarcastic. She clutched the quilt, and there were drops of water dripping from her closed eyes. She didn't make a sound, and her body trembled slightly. The sound of low sobbing could be clearly heard, and it was restrained and soft. "You said so much, but you just want me to feed your son." Shenluo's body stiffened, and he turned his head to look. Shenmanting buried her face in the quilt, and only a small part of her white forehead was exposed. "Shenluo, everyone is so tired, why don't we part ways?" Shenluo's heart suddenly sank. "I'll raise the baby, and I'll pay you back all your expenses this month. Give me some time, and I'll definitely pay you back." Her voice was choked, and it was sullen under the quilt. Shenluo sneered, and his voice was filled with contempt, "Can you pay me back?" Shenmanting didn't directly answer his question, but said, "You forced me during those days, and we have no feelings for each other at all." After waking up, Shenmanting was calmer than ever. However, the words that came out of his mouth were really more annoying than the previous one. "Whether there are feelings or not, it's not up to you to decide." Shenluo announced in a deep voice, "Little Moon is my son, and as his father, I have the right and responsibility to raise him. Do you want to take the child away?" "Not in this lifetime." "Then I can only go through the legal process." Shenmanting had already stopped sobbing, and her voice sounded a little threatening. "You raped me, and this child is the best proof." "Ha!" Shenluo sneered. "Who can prove that it was a rape? You've already given birth to a child. If you really hate me that much, why did you give birth to him?" Shenmanting froze. He bent down and whispered in her ear, "Actually, you love me, don't you?" She was dependent on him. For a long time, Shenluo had this feeling. She hated him and wanted to break free from him, but she couldn't. Shenmanting's heart was actually a little twisted. He knew it better than anyone else. However, when Shenmanting heard this, she suddenly burst into laughter. He lifted the quilt and immediately felt a gust of hot air on his face. In a moment, he met Shenmanting's red eyes. "Who do you think would fall in love with a rapist?" Shenluo was shocked to see her like this. There was a thought in his mind that was trying to stop his desire to verbally attack. Chapter 1971. Have you ever heard of Stockholm Syndrome? It was a strange yet familiar term. Shenmanting opened her eyes and looked at him. It was a psychological disease. The abused developed a distorted mentality of dependence, habit, and even love for the abuser. Shenmanting used to think that it was an extreme perverted mentality. It was no exception now. But when Shenluo mentioned it, she suddenly remembered it. She was stunned for a moment, then laughed and said, "I didn't expect you to be so good at daydreaming." Shenluo was not angry when he heard this. He quickly stood up with the baby in his arms. The baby was still awake and didn't cry. He blinked his eyes and looked at him. He handed the baby over and said, "I'll ask Aunt Lin to bring some food." "No need." Shenmanting took the baby. "Let's take this opportunity to make things clear. Don't even think about it." Shenluo's face darkened. Aunt Lin's daughter is about to give birth. It's impossible for her to take care of us for the rest of our lives. The best way is to go back to the capital in a few days and get married at the Civil Affairs Bureau. You want to marry me? Enchanting's pale face was a little shocked. She had never thought of this question. Marry him? She didn't even dare to think about it. My child wants a mother. Enchanting almost roared, this is my child. Shenluo and looked at her for a long time and said word by word, he also wants a father. He was unexpectedly calm. She thought that he would be furious. Enchanting sneered. Her eyes were firm and her words were almost squeezed out from between her teeth. Shenluo and, I can't marry you. Shenluo and didn't answer. He turned his head and turned to make a phone call. He told Aunt Lin to send food and then hung up the phone. Enchanting held the baby and was quiet for a while. Then she lifted her clothes and fed the baby. No one spoke again. The atmosphere was unexpectedly harmonious. Shenluo and didn't lose his temper, so she couldn't make a fuss. However, this feeling made her feel uncomfortable. It shouldn't be like this. She actually wanted Shenluo and to lose his temper, so that she could take the baby away and never see him again. She wanted the child, but this man was not her husband. After feeding the baby soon fell asleep. There's no more water. Shenluo and looked up at the medicine bag above his head and pressed the call button. The nurse came over to remove the needle. After resting for a while, Enchanting said, tell Aunt Lin not to come anymore. It's not over yet. Have you noticed? Your emotions are very unstable. I suspect that you have postpartum depression. Let's go to the psychiatrist together. Another new move. Enchanting held the baby in her arms and looked at him. You want the doctor to determine that I'm mentally ill and can't take care of the child, and then take the child away from me, right? Enchanting felt that her suspicion was reasonable. However, Shenluo's face darkened even further. He sneered, I think you're not just suffering from depression. You're also suffering from paranoia. Enchanting didn't say anything. She looked at him coldly. Shenluo suppressed his anger and said, if I wanted to take the child away, I could have done so after you gave birth. At that time, you were weak. If I took action, you wouldn't have had a chance to resist. I will die, so I didn't do that. Shenluo interrupted her. His tone was a little heavy. I will have a better chance later. After you fall asleep, I will quietly take the child away. Will you know? Chapter 1972. Yes. During this period of time, she had been too relaxed with him. When Shenluo first moved in, she was still a little wary. But later, she became more and more accustomed to his existence and completely let down her guard. It was just as he said. If he wanted to take the baby away suddenly, she wouldn't be able to find out. Shenluo saw her expression and laughed. Don't think that everyone is as heartless as you. Enchanting, no one in our family has treated you badly during your time in the Shen family. You know very well how good grandmother has been to you. So what? Enchanting found it ridiculous. You were good to me because you felt guilty. In the beginning, I really treated you as family, but what happened later? Later, when Shenluo was drunk, he pressed her against the sink in the bathroom. He violently and heavily invaded her. After the first time, there would be a second and a third time. At that time, he still had a wife. She couldn't believe that he could sleep with his sister behind his family's back. From that day, she knew that he was a pervert. A pervert that she had never seen before. In the beginning, she felt extremely guilty toward Yi Yu. All she could think about was getting married. Only when she got married and was with Ming would he let her go. However, Shen Luo and had imprisoned her in a dark room over and over again. He had made her do dirty things that couldn't be exposed to the light. No woman could stand that kind of life. Shen Manting still had a lingering fear when she thought of that time. Later, Shen Luo narrowed his eyes. Did I not treat you well? Ha ha. Shen Manting sneered but didn't say anything. I gave you whatever you wanted. I didn't have to worry about food or clothing. Except for being a little rough with you sometimes, I don't think I've done anything wrong to you. Shen Luo looked at her. Their child was lying beside her. Manting, now that we have a son, don't be angry with me anymore. Let's get married, raise little Moon together, and build a happy family. Isn't that good? Shen Manting looked at him coldly. A happy family. Marriage? Except for being a little rough sometimes, he didn't do anything wrong to her. Haha, Shen Manting looked away and sneered. Shen Luo Tan's anger, which he had suppressed with great difficulty, flared up again. What kind of expression is that? Shen Manting sneered. Don't you think what you're saying is ridiculous? Laughable? Shen Luo stared at her. I treat you with sincerity. Every word I say is true. I really want to marry you. I really want to give our child a home. I really want to give you a proper status. Is that ridiculous? I won't be with you, Shen Luo. Shen Manting looked at him with sadness in her eyes. Let me go. I'm tired. Really? Shen Manting's eyes were filled with sorrow. His eyes were slightly red, and his face was pale. She was looking at him with a rare calmness. She was calm and serious. His words made Shen Luo's heart clench. Even his anger seemed to be blocked by her words, unable to go up or down. After staring at her for a long time, Shen Luo suddenly stood up. Shen Manting was shocked. Just as she was wondering what he was going to do, he suddenly turned around. Chapter 1973. Shen Luo left suddenly. For a moment, Shen Manting didn't come to her senses. Manting. It was Aunt Lin who asked tentatively. Aunt Lin came in with a thermos and looked at it. Where's Sir? She asked. I don't know. Shen Manting leaned against the headboard. I'm hungry. Oh, it's here. Aunt Lin put down the thermos and poured out a bowl of soup with a lid. She said, I made this tonic soup early in the morning. There are herbs and meat in it. I'll scoop it up for you after you finish it. Shen Manting looked at the ginseng chicken soup in her hand and took a sip after a long while. Hey, it's not easy for a young couple to live together. You can't quarrel even if it's for the sake of the child. Aunt Lin tried to persuade her. When the child grows up, you'll find that it'll be over soon. Sir has a bad temper, so you should be more tolerant. In fact, he has a good heart and cares about you very much. It's just that he may not be able to say anything nice. Shen Manting didn't say anything and listened to her in silence. Manting, the baby is still young and needs the love of his parents. As a mother, you shouldn't quarrel with him in front of him, let alone hit him. When Shen Manting heard this, she suddenly felt sad. Tears welled up in his eyes uncontrollably, and they rolled down his face. Her tears dripped into the bowl, but Shen Manting laughed. In your eyes, I'm being unreasonable, am I? Shen Manting's tone was not very good. She smiled, but it was uglier than crying. Aunt Lin was speechless. After a while, she said, I didn't say that, but it's impossible for Sir to be so angry for no reason. You must have said something wrong. During this period of time, Shen Luo was quite good. Shen Manting, on the other hand, looked like she had seen a ghost when she saw him. Sometimes she avoided him like a snake or scorpion, and sometimes she was very natural. However, the relationship between the two of them was never intimate. It was obvious that Enchanting was afraid of him. But Aunt Lin saw how well Shenluo and treated Enchanting. In all fairness, Shenluo and really had no other problems except for his bad temper. Enchanting felt even more ridiculous. But she couldn't laugh. Now, even outsiders felt that she was being unreasonable. No matter what, Shenluo and always had a reason. There was a reason why he got angry, a reason why he hit her, and a reason why he humiliated her. Just because he has money. Just because he was the real employer. Enchanting looked at the chicken soup in her hand and suddenly tilted her head back and drank it in one gulp. He returned the cup and said, "Then, if he and I are destined to be separated, do you think I can afford to raise the child?" Auntie Lin was shocked. Did she want a divorce? Her heart was beating like a drum. Aunt Lin guessed for a moment before she said, "I think you should raise him with Sir. Children need a home. No matter if it's a father or a mother, you can't have one less. I can't live with him." Enchanting stared at Aunt Lin. "He's my brother." Aunt Lin gasped when she heard that. He stared at her in disbelief, as if he had seen a ghost. A pair of eyes stared into her face, trying to find some semblance of a mischievous expression. But, no. Not one bit. Enchanting was very serious. When she saw the expression on Aunt Lin's face, she actually felt a little happy that Aunt Lin shared a common enemy with her. Chapter 1974. It's hard to believe, isn't it? Enchanting sneered. We share the same surname. Haven't you ever doubted it? Of course Aunt Lin doubted it. But what could the same surname prove? There were many couples with the same surname. What made her curious was that Enchanting had always been afraid of Shenluo and she had thought that there was a knot between them. But she didn't expect that to be the reason. Brother and sister. Biological brother and sister. Manting, are you kidding? Aunt Lin couldn't believe it. You don't look alike at all, and, if you are really brother and sister, why did you give birth to the child? Aren't you afraid? Aren't you afraid of deformity? Now, the child won't be deformed. But the child born to biological brother and sister is likely to be mentally retarded, have cerebral palsy, or even have invisible diseases. Such a price was too heavy. For a child, it would be better not to have been born into this world in the first place if such a fate were to befall him. Enchanting heard Aunt Lin's words and smiled. But at the same time, tears fell. We are not related by blood. Aunt Lin immediately breathed a sigh of relief. That's good, that's good. You haven't answered me yet, Enchanting repeated the question. Who do you think the child will be better off with? Aunt Lin frowned and said, You don't want to be with him. Who would want to be husband and wife with their own brother? Ah, how can a woman bear to give up the baby? Aunt Lin was also a mother, so she naturally understood this feeling. It was impossible to give up the blood relationship with the child. But now as an outsider, she heard Enchanting's words and sighed softly. But in all fairness, if you are destined not to be together, then it will be better for the baby to be with Sir. That was the expected answer. Enchanting felt like a knife was being twisted in her heart, but she still didn't give up. She asked, why? First of all, Sir's financial ability is better than yours. As a woman, your ability to earn money is inferior to that of a man. Moreover, your health is not very good. I'm not in poor health. You are weak and anemic. These are all problems. These small problems have to be taken care of, or they will accidentally become serious problems. Aunt Lin looked at her. Moreover, the baby needs a good material life. Sir can provide these, but can you? She couldn't. If she took care of a baby, she would not have the ability or energy to earn money. Once she lost her source of income, she might not even be able to support herself. Manting, sir, is actually quite nice. I got it, Manting interrupted. I got it. His voice was very low, with an indiscernible stillness. What do you know? Auntie Lin looked at her. You're still not in good health. You need to stay on the drip for a few days to nourish your body. Don't quarrel with Sir again. Yes. Manting lowered her head and looked sideways at the infant lying next to her. I know. You can go back now. Aunt Lin sensed that something was amiss. Are you all right? It's okay. You can go. Leave the soup here. I'll drink it myself when I'm hungry. Aunt Lin was relieved to hear that. If he knew how to drink soup, it meant that he wouldn't do anything stupid. Auntie Lin looked at the time and said, all right then, I'm leaving. When Sir comes back later, you can ask him to talk to you. Yes. Chapter 1975. The baby was already asleep. He clenched his fists and breathed steadily. Manting looked at the baby next to her for a long time before getting out of bed. After she went to the bathroom, a nurse came over and asked, Manting. Yes. Manting looked up at her. The nurse glanced at her and said, go to the psychiatry department. Your husband is waiting for you there. Psychiatry department. Husband. Manting smiled and replied, got it. The nurse didn't care and turned around to leave. Manting put on her shoes and walked to the psychiatry department with the baby in her arms. The psychiatry department was on the 9th floor. When she arrived, she saw Luo and standing by the window in the corridor. He reached out his hand when he saw her. Manting glanced at him and then handed the baby to him. To be honest, she was also very curious about the results of the examination. She sat in front of the doctor, but the doctor didn't rush to ask any sensitive questions. Instead, he chatted with her about daily life. Manting was a little wary at first, but she gradually let her guard down. How old is the baby? 1 month. I just got out of confinement. Oh. Then is the milk he's been drinking recently breast milk or mixed with milk powder? Both. Manting frowned and said, but does this have anything to do with me? The doctor smiled and said, it doesn't matter. I just want to know more. Manting felt a little impatient and her eyes were a little unfocused. The doctor didn't say anything and lowered his head to write something in his notebook. Luo and waited for her outside. He held the baby in his arms and felt lonely in his heart. The baby was theirs, but Manting didn't want to be with him. It seemed that she wanted to leave with the baby. Luo and only felt more irritated. He looked at the distant sky and sighed. Manting had been in there for more than an hour, but there was still no movement. The baby woke up but didn't cry. A pair of black eyes looked at Luo and, pure and bright. Manting walked out of the room with her head lowered and didn't say a word. Luo and stood up and asked, how is it? Manting smiled and said, postpartum depression and paranoia. Luo and was stunned by these two terms. Manting walked around him and whispered, are you happy? What are you talking about? Luo and frowned deeply. How can I be happy when you're like this? Did they give you a prescription? Okay. Manting took out a form and said, let's go and pay the bill. Manting was behaving strangely today. He seemed to have become abnormally calm. He was terrifyingly calm. Shen Luo and took the list and handed the baby over. Shen Manting carried the baby to the nursery and returned to the ward. She was admitted to the hospital at the last minute, so everything was at home. They sat on the edge of the bed and waited for Shen Luo Anne's return before they went back together. It was almost dinner time. Aunt Lin had already prepared dinner. She glanced at Shen Manting and asked, "Manting, did you bring the thermos flask back?" Shen Manting suddenly remembered. "I forgot." Auntie Lin felt a little regretful. "Forget it. Let's eat. Give me the baby." Shen Manting handed the baby over and washed her hands. She picked up a bowl of rice and ate quietly. Shen Luo and sat in front of her and couldn't stand it anymore. He said, "What's wrong with you? Tell me. Don't look so lifeless. It's an eyesore." You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.